Hey guys, tonight we begin with a journey to the coldest place on Earth. Not the modern version, where you can warm up in a coffee shop or wrap your car in something locals call a Natasha. We're going further back, to a time when the same frozen landscape existed, with the same brutal temperatures, the same blinding fog, the same air so cold it hurts to breathe. But with no escape, no technology, no choice. So, before you get comfortable in your warm bed, take a moment to like this video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Imagine this. It's 1881. You're standing in a prison transport somewhere deep in Siberia. The year doesn't matter much anymore. Neither does the month. What matters is the cold. It's so cold that your breath freezes before it leaves your mouth. So cold that mercury thermometers stop working because the mercury itself has frozen solid. So cold that the guards who brought you here look almost as miserable as you do. This is Verkhoyansk, one of two places that claim the title of coldest inhabited place on Earth. The other is Omikon, just a few hundred kilometers away. Together, they form what Russians call the Pole of Cold, and this is where you'll spend the next several years of your life, if you survive. Today, people live in this region by choice. They have heated buildings, insulated clothing, modern medicine, and the ability to leave whenever they want. But you have none of that. You're a political exile, sent here by the Tsar's government to freeze, to suffer, and quite possibly to die. Your crime? Perhaps you spoke against the government. Perhaps you were in the wrong place at the wrong time. Perhaps you simply knew someone who once said something critical about the Tsar. It doesn't matter now. What matters is survival. And survival in the coldest place on Earth, without any of the advantages of modern life, is nearly impossible. Over the next 2 hours, we're going to walk through your experience. From the moment of your arrest in the relative warmth of Moscow or St. Petersburg, through the months-long journey east into deepening cold, to your arrival at a place so hostile to human life that simply breathing becomes an act of endurance. We'll experience what it's like when the temperature drops to minus 50 degrees Celsius, when it drops to minus 60, when the thermometers can no longer measure how cold it's become because the mercury inside them has turned solid. We'll learn what happens when there's no heated garage to protect you, no coffee shop to warm up in, no modern clothing designed for extreme cold. We'll understand why frostbite wasn't just a risk, it was inevitable. And we'll discover how some people, against all odds, managed to survive in conditions that would kill most modern people within hours. This isn't a story about adventure or exploration. It's a story about punishment, about suffering, about what happens when human beings are forced to endure the most extreme climate on Earth with nothing but crude shelters, inadequate clothing, and their own determination to see another day. So settle in, get comfortable, because tonight we're going to a place where comfort doesn't exist, where warmth is a distant memory, where survival itself becomes the only goal that matters. Welcome to Siberian exile. Welcome to the coldest place on Earth in history. Chapter 1. The warmth you'll never feel again. Before the cold, there was warmth. It's important to remember this, because the contrast is what makes the suffering bearable or unbearable, depending on how you look at it. You need to remember warmth to have something to hold on to. But remembering warmth also makes the cold cut deeper. Let's say you lived in Moscow, not in a palace, certainly. You weren't nobility, but you had a small apartment. maybe shared with family or other lodgers. It wasn't luxurious, but it had a stove. A proper Russian stove. The kind that took up a quarter of the room and radiated heat for hours after the fire died down. In winter, that stove was the center of life. You'd cook on it, dry clothes on it, and on the coldest nights, you might even sleep on top of it or near it. Your apartment had windows with real glass. Double layered, if you were lucky, but even single layered glass was a luxury compared to what was coming. The windows would frost over in winter, creating intricate patterns of ice crystals that caught the morning light. You'd scrape them off to see outside, to watch the snow falling on the street below. You had a bed. Not a great bed, probably just a wooden frame with a straw mattress. But it was yours, and it had blankets. Wool blankets that smelled of lanolin and smoke. They were heavy and warm, and when you pulled them up to your chin on a cold night, you felt safe. You had clothing. Not much, but enough. A winter coat made of wool, maybe lined with cotton or even a bit of fur if you'd saved for it. Gloves. A hat. Boots that kept most of the snow out most of the time. You could walk through a Moscow winter and survive it comfortably, or at least survive it. There was food, nothing fancy. Black bread, mostly. Cabbage soup. Porridge made from buckwheat or oats. Sometimes fish. Once in a while, if you had a little extra money, a bit of meat. But you ate every day. Sometimes you were hungry, but you weren't starving. The food was hot when it needed to be hot, and there was tea. Always tea. Sweet, hot, strong tea that warmed you from the inside. And there were people. Family, friends, neighbors. The marketplace where you'd buy your food, where vendors called out their prices and housewives bargained and children ran between the stalls. The church where you'd go on Sundays, where candles burned and incense hung in the air. The tavern where workers would gather in the evening, where conversation and laughter filled the smoky room. Life wasn't easy. This was the 1880s in Russia, after all. Most people were poor. Work was hard. The government was oppressive. But life continued. There were rhythms to the days, rhythms to the seasons. There was hope that tomorrow might be slightly better than today. There was the possibility of change. That possibility is what led to your arrest. Perhaps you attended a meeting, just a gathering of people who wanted to discuss ideas about government, about society, about how things might be better. Or perhaps you simply read the wrong book, or knew someone who attended those meetings, or spoke a bit too freely after a few drinks at the tavern. The exact reason doesn't matter. What matters is that one evening there was a knock at your door, heavy, authoritative. When you opened it, there were two gendarmes in their dark uniforms and tall caps. Behind them, the street was dark and cold. Snow was falling softly. "You're under arrest," one of them said. They didn't explain why. They didn't need to. The gendarmes never needed to explain. You were given a few minutes to gather some belongings. Your coat, your boots, whatever you could grab. Your family, if you had family present, watched in silent horror. There was nothing they could do. Arguing would only make things worse, possibly get them arrested too. And then you were let out into the snowy street, away from the stove's warmth, away from the smell of tea and bread, away from your bed, your home, your life. The last thing you noticed as they led you away was how warm the air felt. It was probably -5 or -10 Celsius, cold by most standards. But compared to what was coming, it was almost pleasant. You didn't know that yet, of course. You thought this was cold. You had no idea what cold really meant. The arrest led to imprisonment in Moscow. probably at the Butyrka prison. You spent weeks there, maybe months, waiting for a trial that might never come, or that came and lasted all of 15 minutes. Political crimes were treated harshly under Tsar Alexander III. The government was paranoid about revolutionaries, about anyone who might threaten the established order. Your sentence, when it came, was simple: exile to Siberia. 5 years. 10 years. Sometimes longer. Sometimes life. You tried to imagine what that meant. Siberia. Dyson. You'd heard of it, of course. Everyone had. It was where the government sent people it wanted to forget. It was cold there. You knew that much. Cold and far away. But you'd survived Russian winters before. How much worse could it be? You were about to find out. The last night before the journey, you lay on the stone floor of your cell, wrapped in the thin blanket they'd given you. You could still feel warmth. Even here, your own body heat, trapped by the blanket. The warmth of other prisoners packed into the same space. The distant warmth from a stove somewhere in the guards' quarters. You tried to memorize that feeling. The feeling of being warm, or at least warm enough. You tried to store it away somewhere in your memory, someplace you could return to when you needed it. You would need it soon, more desperately than you could possibly imagine. Because tomorrow, the journey east would begin. And with every mile, with every day, with every week that passed, the warmth would fade. The temperature would drop. The landscape would become more alien, more hostile, more impossible. And there would be no turning back, no escape, no reprieve. Only the cold, waiting for you. Patient, inevitable, absolute. Chapter 2. The Iron Road East. The journey to Siberia began with a train. Not a comfortable train like you might imagine. These were prison transports, specially designed to move large numbers of prisoners eastward, away from the populated centers of European Russia and into the vast emptiness beyond the Ural Mountains. You were loaded into a boxcar with perhaps 30 or 40 other prisoners. The car had been designed to carry freight, not people. There were small windows near the roof, barred and too high to see out of easily. Benches lined the walls, but there weren't nearly enough for everyone. Most prisoners had to sit on the floor or stand. The car smelled of unwashed bodies, of fear, of the wooden walls themselves, which had absorbed decades of human suffering. This wasn't the first group of exiles this car had carried. It wouldn't be the last. Outside, the platform was busy with guards shouting orders, families saying frantic last-minute goodbyes to those being sent away. Some prisoners had relatives who'd come to see them off, pressing small bundles of food or clothing through the bars, whispering words of encouragement or grief. Others had no one. They sat in silence, staring at nothing. You found a spot near one of the walls and sat down. The wooden floor was cold, even through your clothing. Autumn was ending. It was probably November, now be early December. The air had that particular bite that comes just before winter really settles in. The train lurched forward with a metallic screech. The journey had begun. For the first few days, the landscape outside was still relatively familiar. Forests of birch and pine derry, small villages with wooden houses painted in faded colors, rivers crossed by long wooden bridges. The prisoners talked among themselves, sharing names, stories, sometimes food. There was a strange camaraderie in shared misery. You learned that the man next to you was a teacher who'd been accused of spreading dangerous ideas to his students. Across from you sat a peasant who'd been involved in a land dispute with a local noble. Further down the car was a young woman, perhaps 20 years old, who'd been arrested for attending a meeting of socialist sympathizers. She sat very still, arms wrapped around herself, staring at the floor. The train moved slowly, stopping frequently. sometimes to take on water for the engine, sometimes for reasons no one explained. During these stops, prisoners were let out in groups to relieve themselves, always under heavy guard. The guards carried rifles and looked bored, which somehow made them more frightening. Bored guards were unpredictable. At night, the temperature in the car dropped significantly. You'd pull your coat tighter, press against the other prisoners for warmth. Sleep came in brief, uncomfortable intervals. You'd doze off sitting up, wake with a stiff neck, doze off again. The rhythm of the train became the rhythm of your existence. The clickety-clack of wheels on rails, on and on, carrying you east. After several days, the landscape began to change. The forests grew denser. The villages became smaller and farther apart. The temperature dropped noticeably. Frost began to appear on the inside of the boxcar walls in the morning. Your breath made white clouds that hung in the cold air. Then came the Urals. The train climbed slowly up into the mountains that formed the border between Europe and Asia. The temperature dropped further. Snow began to fall. At first, just a dusting, then more heavily. The prisoners huddled together more closely now. The camaraderie of the first few days was fading, replaced by a kind of grim endurance. Some people were getting sick. The cold, the poor ventilation, the stress, the inadequate food, all of it took a toll. The man who'd been a teacher developed a deep, rattling cough. The young woman looked pale and feverish. There was nothing to be done. No medical care. The guards didn't care if prisoners were sick. They'd deliver whoever survived. One morning, an older prisoner simply didn't wake up. He'd been sitting in the corner, bundled in his coat, and at some point during the night his heart had given out. The other prisoners discovered this only when the train stopped and someone tried to rouse him. The body was removed without ceremony. The train continued. This became a pattern. Every few days, another death. The very young and very old went first. Those who were already weak when the journey began. Those who gave up hope. The guards would remove the bodies during stops, and the train would continue eastward. You crossed the Urals and entered Siberia proper. The word Siberia comes from a Turkic word meaning sleeping land. And looking out through the small windows, you could see why. The landscape was vast, empty, silent. Endless forests of pine and larch, their branches heavy with snow. Frozen rivers like white ribbons cutting through the trees. Sky that seemed too big, too gray, too indifferent to human suffering. The train would stop at small stations where supplies were loaded. Sometimes prisoners were given food, more black bread, thin soup, occasionally salted fish. The food was never enough. You were hungry constantly. Not starving, not yet, but hungry in a way that made you think about food all the time. You'd remember meals from your previous life with an intensity that was almost painful. The taste of buttered bread, the smell of baked potatoes, the warmth of hot tea spreading through your chest. At one station, perhaps 2 weeks into the journey, the train stopped for the night. Prisoners were let out in groups to relieve themselves. As you stepped off the train, the cold hit you like a physical force. It was much colder than anything you'd experienced in Moscow. The air hurt to breathe. It felt like it was burning your lungs, though of course it was doing the opposite. It was freezing them. Your breath came out in thick white clouds. When you looked around at the other prisoners, you could see ice forming on their beards and mustaches from their frozen breath. Your own face felt stiff, almost numb. Your fingers started to ache inside your gloves. You'd been outside for maybe 2 minutes. This, you realized, was just the beginning. This was still early winter, and you were still in western Siberia. The journey had weeks left to go. The temperature would drop further, much further. Back in the boxcar, Prisoners huddled together desperately. Some had started wrapping their feet in rags, extra layers to try to keep the cold out. Others fashioned crude hoods from spare cloth to protect their faces. Everyone tried to stay near the center of the car, away from the walls which were now coated with a layer of frost on the inside. The teacher with the cough died a few days later. His body was removed at the next station. You'd never learned his first name. Days blurred into weeks. The train continued east, always east. The stops became less frequent. The stations, when they appeared, were smaller, more primitive. Sometimes just a platform in the middle of nowhere, a few wooden buildings half buried in snow. You lost track of time. Was it late December now? Early January? The darkness lasted longer each day. In this part of Siberia, winter days were short, maybe 6 or 7 hours of weak sunlight, the rest darkness. The prisoners slept more, or tried to. What else was there to do? Sleep was an escape from the cold, from the hunger, from the uncertainty of what awaited at journey's end. Sometime in January, you thought it was January, though you couldn't be sure, the train finally reached Irkutsk. This was as far as the railway went. From here, the journey would continue by other means. Sleds, horse-drawn carts, on foot. You were let off the train in a group of about 20 prisoners. The others from your boxcar were being sent to different locations. You never saw most of them again. You wondered, briefly, how many would survive. How many had already died on this train behind you? Irkutsk was a real city, surprisingly large and developed for being this far into Siberia. There were churches with onion domes, administrative buildings, homes with smoking chimneys. For a moment, you felt a strange hope. If people could live here, if there could be a city here, perhaps it wouldn't be so bad. But you weren't staying in Irkutsk. You were going much further, to the pole of cold itself, to Verkhoyansk, nearly 3,000 kilometers to the northeast, to a place where Irkutsk's winter would seem mild by comparison. The next phase of the journey would take months, and it would be on foot through the coldest winter landscape on Earth. As you stood on the platform in Irkutsk, waiting to be loaded onto sleds for the next leg of the journey, you looked up at the sky. It was late afternoon, and the sun was already setting. The temperature was perhaps minus 35 Celsius, cold enough that your eyelashes were starting to stick together with ice. And you thought, if this is minus 35, what does minus 60 feel like? You were about to find out. Chapter 3, When Cold Becomes Pain. The journey from Irkutsk to Verkhoyansk took nearly 3 months. 3 months of moving through a landscape that seemed increasingly hostile to human existence. 3 months during which you learned, slowly and painfully, that cold is not just a temperature. It's a force. It's a presence. It's alive in its own way, and it wants you dead. The first week out of Irkutsk wasn't too bad, relatively speaking. You traveled in a convoy of sleds pulled by horses, bundled under whatever blankets and furs the guards would allow. The sleds moved slowly over packed snow trails that had been used for generations. Other prisoners walked alongside when there wasn't room on the sleds. The guards rode on horseback, wrapped in proper winter clothing, thick fur coats, felt boots, fur hats with ear flaps. You had none of that. You had the wool coat you'd been arrested in, now worn and dirty. You had the thin blanket from the train. You had boots that were never designed for this kind of cold. You wrapped your feet in rags trying to add layers. You wrapped your face when you could, leaving just your eyes exposed. But it was never enough. The cold at this stage was around minus 40 Celsius. This is the temperature at which Fahrenheit and Celsius meet. Minus 40 is the same in both scales. It's also the temperature at which many things stop working normally. Mercury thermometers freeze. Metal becomes brittle. Rubber cracks. and human tissue begins to die. Your face was the first thing to feel it. Exposed skin in minus 40-degree weather can get frostbite in under 10 minutes. Your cheeks felt tight, numb. Your nose burned with a sensation that wasn't quite pain, but was definitely wrong. You learned to keep moving your fingers and toes constantly, even when sitting on the sled, because stillness meant freezing. The teacher who walked near you, a different teacher than the one who died on the train, showed you a trick. He'd breathe out slowly through his mouth, catching the moisture from his breath in a rag held in front of his face. This prevented the moisture from freezing on his beard and face. It was a small thing, but small things mattered now. At night, the convoy would stop and guards would build fires. The prisoners were allowed to approach the fires in groups, to warm themselves briefly before being rotated out, so others could have a turn. Those few minutes near the fire were precious beyond description. The heat on your face felt almost painful after hours of numbness. Your hands would tingle and burn as blood flow returned. You'd stand as close as you dared, absorbing every bit of warmth you could. But the fires couldn't burn all night. Fuel was limited out here. Eventually, the fires would die down, and everyone would huddle together under whatever shelter could be improvised. Sometimes, there were small wooden buildings at the stopping points, way stations built for exactly this kind of journey. More often, there was nothing. You'd pile together with other prisoners, sharing body heat, trying to sleep despite the cold that seeped through every layer of clothing. You learned to sleep sitting up, leaning against others, because lying down on the snow would kill you. You learned not to breathe too deeply, because the cold air hurt your lungs. You learned to ignore the constant shivering, the chattering teeth, the ache in your bones that never quite went away. After 2 weeks, the first prisoner lost a toe to frostbite. He'd walked most of the way and hadn't noticed at first. Frostbite is strange. It doesn't always hurt immediately. The tissue freezes, ice crystals forming between cells, and you might not realize it's happening until later when you try to warm up and the damage reveals itself. His toe had turned black. One of the guards looked at it, shrugged, and said it would probably fall off on its own eventually. There was no medical treatment, nothing to be done. The man continued walking, limping now, clearly in pain, but trying to hide it. Showing weakness was dangerous. The convoy moved northeast, always northeast. The landscape became even more desolate. The forests thinned out. The distances between any signs of human habitation grew longer. Days would pass where you saw nothing but snow and sky, and the occasional frozen river. And it got colder. The temperature dropped from minus 40 to minus 45, then minus 50. At these temperatures, strange things happen. Your breath doesn't just create a white cloud. It freezes instantly into tiny ice crystals that make a faint tinkling sound as they fall. The Russians call this the whisper of the stars. It sounds poetic until you're living through it. At minus 50, if you spit, the saliva freezes before it hits the ground. This became a kind of grim game among the prisoners during breaks, testing just how cold it was by how fast things froze. Metal became dangerous to touch even through gloves. One prisoner absent-mindedly grabbed a metal part of the sled with his bare hand during a stop. His skin froze to the metal instantly. When he pulled away, he left skin behind. His palm was raw and bleeding, and in this cold, that was a death sentence. The wound couldn't heal properly. It would get infected. He died 2 weeks later. Your clothing was inadequate in ways that were becoming fatal. The coat, designed for Moscow winters, couldn't handle this. The cold went straight through it. You layered everything you had, the coat, the blanket, rags, anything you could wrap around yourself, but it wasn't enough. Your body was constantly fighting to maintain its core temperature, burning through the few calories you got from the inadequate food. Speaking of food, it had become almost impossible to eat. The black bread they gave you was frozen, solid. You'd have to hold it inside your coat against your body for an hour just to soften it enough to bite. The tea they served at stops would begin to freeze in the cup as you drank it. You learned to drink it fast, scalding your mouth, because the warmth was worth it even if it hurt. A month into this phase of the journey, you noticed your voice had changed. It hurt to talk. Your throat was raw from breathing the cold, dry air. Many prisoners stopped talking altogether, conserving energy, avoiding the pain. The convoy moved in near silence, except for the crunch of snow under feet and sled runners, the occasional command from a guard, the constant low moan of wind. The wind was its own kind of torture. When it picked up, even -40 could feel like -60 or worse. The wind cut through every layer of clothing, finding every gap, every opening. It stole heat from your body faster than you could generate it. During windstorms, the convoy would sometimes have to stop completely, everyone huddling together in whatever shelter they could find or create. You learned what the locals called Siberian wind, a particular kind of blowing snow that reduced visibility to almost nothing. You couldn't see more than a few meters ahead. The world became white, a complete whiteout where sky and ground blended together. People got lost in conditions like this. They'd step away from the group to relieve themselves and never find their way back. You'd hear them calling out, their voices getting fainter, and then nothing. Gone. Done. Frozen somewhere out in the white void. 5 prisoners died during this phase of the journey. 3 from exposure. They simply couldn't keep their body temperature up anymore, and one night, despite being huddled with the others, they didn't wake up. 1 from an infected wound, and 1 who just gave up. He sat down during a rest stop and refused to get up. The guards threatened him, tried to force him, but he wouldn't move. Eventually, they shrugged and left him there. No one knows how long he survived. Maybe hours, maybe minutes. In this cold, it doesn't take long. You kept going because what choice did you have? Stopping meant death. Giving up meant death. The only option was to continue, 1 foot in front of the other, 1 hour at a time, 1 day bleeding into the next. After 6 weeks, you reached the settlement of Yakutsk. This was a real town, larger than you'd expected. Wooden buildings with smoke rising from chimneys. People moving about, going about their lives. It seemed impossible. How could anyone live in this cold? But they did. They had for generations. The prisoners were kept in a prison ostrog on the edge of town for 3 days, while arrangements were made for the final leg of the journey. During this time, you stayed in an actual building with actual walls. There was a stove, though it was never quite warm enough, but compared to the open trail, it felt like luxury. You saw your reflection for the first time in weeks. There was a small piece of mirror in the building, and you barely recognized yourself. Your face was gaunt, the skin tight and chapped. Your beard, you'd grown a beard over these weeks, was matted and dirty. Your eyes looked different. More dirt, tiles. Older, you'd lost weight. Everyone had. Your coat hung looser on your frame. Your hands, when you unwrapped them, were covered in small cracks and sores from the constant cold and dryness. Your lips were cracked and bleeding. Your feet were a disaster of blisters and raw spots. But you still had all your toes. That was something. On the 4th day, the journey continued. Northeast from Yakutsk toward Verkhoyansk, following the frozen Lena River. This was the final stretch. Another 6 weeks of travel through the coldest region on Earth. The temperature was now regularly below minus 50 Celsius. On calm days, it might warm up to minus 45. On bad days, it dropped to minus 55, minus 60. At these temperatures, you entered a different realm of existence. Breathing hurt. Every breath was an effort. You'd instinctively breathe shallowly, trying to warm the air in your mouth and nose before it reached your lungs. Your eyelashes froze together constantly. You'd have to warm them with your hand to blink properly. The horses were suffering too. Their breath formed huge clouds of fog around their heads. Ice built up on their muzzles and around their eyes. Some horses died, simply freezing to death, despite their thick winter coats. When a horse died, it was butchered on the spot, and the meat was distributed. You ate horse meat that had frozen solid before the animal even finished dying. You learned to tell the temperature without a thermometer. Around minus 40, your breath forms regular clouds. At minus 50, your breath freezes into fog that hangs around you. At minus 55, you can hear your breath crackle as it freezes. At minus 60, the world seems to hold its breath. Sound doesn't travel right. Everything is muffled, distant, strange. And still, you continued. Because somewhere ahead, Verkhoyansk waited. Your destination. Your new home. The place where you'd spend the next 5 years. If you survived that long. Chapter 4. The Endless White. Deep into Siberia now, weeks beyond Yakutsk, the landscape had become something out of a dream. Or perhaps a nightmare. It was difficult to tell the difference anymore. Everything was white. The ground, the sky, the air itself seemed white with cold. The horizon disappeared. Sky and snow blended into one seamless void. This was the taiga in deep winter, the vast boreal forest that covers millions of square kilometers of Siberia. But even the forest seemed defeated by the cold. The trees stood like frozen sentinels, their branches heavy with snow and ice. Their bark split from the extreme temperatures. Sometimes you'd hear a crack like a gunshot, the sound of a tree trunk splitting from the cold. Sap freezes and expands, and the wood can't handle it. The trees literally tear themselves apart. The convoy moved slowly through this landscape. The sleds had to navigate between trees, around fallen logs, over frozen streams. The horses struggled, their hooves crunching through crusted snow. The prisoners walked when there wasn't room on the sleds. And walking in this environment was its own special kind of torture. The snow wasn't soft and powdery like you might imagine. At these temperatures, snow becomes different. It's dry, crystalline, almost sharp. It doesn't pack well. Your feet would break through the crust and sink. Each step an effort. The snow squeaked under your boots with every step, a high-pitched sound that became the soundtrack of your existence. And it was quiet, extraordinarily quiet. Sound doesn't travel well in extreme cold. The air is too dense, too still. When someone spoke, their voice seemed to die just a few meters away. When the wind blew, it made a low, hollow sound, like the world itself was moaning. You were perhaps 8 weeks into this final leg of the journey from Yakutsk to Verkhoyansk. 8 weeks of walking and riding through an endless white expanse. 8 weeks of temperatures that rarely rose above minus 50 Celsius and sometimes dropped to minus 60 or below. At minus 60, mercury is solid. The locals had their own ways of measuring temperature. One method involved boiling water and throwing it into the air. At minus 40, it makes a cloud. At minus 50, it freezes with a crackling sound before it hits the ground. At minus 60, it turns to ice crystals instantly, creating a sound like breaking glass. Another method was to listen to your breath. At -65, your breath doesn't just freeze. It makes a sound as it does, a faint hissing, tinkling noise. The locals called it the whisper of the stars or sometimes frozen air. When you could hear your breath making that sound, you knew it was dangerously cold. Too cold to be outside for long. Too cold for almost anything to function normally. But you were outside. You had to be. The journey continued. You'd learn to exist in layers of semi-consciousness. Walking became automatic, your feet moving without thought. Your mind would drift, retreating to memories of warmth. You'd think about the stove in your old apartment in Moscow. You'd remember summer days, the feel of sun on your face, the taste of cold water from a well. These memories kept you sane, kept you moving, but they also made the present more unbearable. The other prisoners had become like ghosts. Everyone was so wrapped in clothing and rags that you could barely see their faces. Communication had mostly stopped. Everyone conserved energy, focused on their own survival. The bonds formed during the train journey had frayed. Out here, in this extreme cold, it was every person for themselves. Except when it wasn't. There was a young man, probably in his early 20s, who'd been struggling for days. His name was Dmitri. He'd lost several toes to frostbite back near Yakutsk, and had been walking with obvious pain since then. Now, deep in the taiga, he was falling behind. The guards noticed, but didn't care. If he couldn't keep up, that was his problem. You don't know why you did it. Maybe because he reminded you of your younger brother back in Moscow. Maybe because you still had enough humanity left to care. Maybe just because giving up meant letting the cold win. During a rest stop, you helped him wrap his feet with some of your own rags. You gave him half of your bread ration that evening. The next day, you stayed near him, encouraging him to keep moving, helping him up when he stumbled. Another prisoner, an older man named Ivan, noticed and joined your effort. Together, you kept Dmitri moving. It cost you energy you couldn't spare. It slowed you down, putting you at risk. But it gave you purpose beyond mere survival. This pattern played out in small ways throughout the convoy. Despite the overwhelming focus on individual survival, there were moments of unexpected kindness. A prisoner would share a bit of food. Someone would help another adjust their wrappings against the cold. These tiny acts of humanity, occurring in the most inhuman environment imaginable, were what kept many people alive. The days had become almost meaningless. In late January and early February, at this latitude, the sun barely rose. You'd maybe 3 or 4 hours of weak, gray light. Not even full daylight, just a dim glow on the southern horizon. The rest was darkness. You traveled in darkness, stopped in darkness, huddled together for warmth in darkness. The darkness made the cold feel colder somehow. Without the sun, even the weak winter sun, there was no hope of warmth. The darkness made the cold feel colder somehow. Without the sun, even the weak winter sun, there was no hope of warmth. The world became a place of absolute negatives. No light, no heat, no comfort. Just existence, stripped down to its most basic form. Breathe, move, survive. During one particularly dark stretch, perhaps 10 days of near constant darkness, with only brief twilight at midday, something strange happened to your perception of time. Without the normal cycle of day and night, without any routine beyond walk and stop and walk again, hours blended together. You'd think you'd been walking for an entire day, only to realize it had been 3 hours. Or you'd think it was time to stop for the night, only to be told you'd just started moving an hour ago. The guards kept track of time with pocket watches, though even those became unreliable in the extreme cold. The oil inside would thicken, the mechanisms would freeze. Time itself seemed to stop working properly at the pole of cold. You developed a kind of walking meditation. 1 foot then the other. Breathe in slowly through your nose, warming the air. Breathe out through your mouth, trying not to let the moisture freeze on your face. Don't think about the destination, how far you still have to go. Don't think about the cold. Don't think at all if you can help it. Just walk. The landscape offered no variety, no landmarks to mark progress. Just trees and snow and more trees and more snow. Occasionally you'd cross a frozen river, the ice thick enough to support the sleds and horses. The wind would blow across the open ice with nothing to stop it, and those crossings were agony. Everyone would huddle together on the sleds, and the horses would lower their heads and push forward through the wind-driven snow. One night, or was it day? It was hard to tell. The convoy stopped near a frozen lake. The guards built fires as usual, and the prisoners gathered around. You were standing near the fire, finally feeling some warmth seeping through your layers, when you noticed something strange in the sky. The aurora borealis, the northern lights. Green curtains of light rippling across the darkness, moving and shifting like something alive. You'd heard of them, but never seen them. None of the other prisoners had either. Everyone stopped and stared. For a few minutes, the cold was forgotten. The suffering was forgotten. There was only beauty. The lights danced and swirled, green and sometimes white or pale red, covering half the sky. They moved in waves and spirals and patterns that seemed almost purposeful. "It's the spirits of the dead," one of the guards said quietly. He was a local Yakut, not Russian, and he had his own beliefs. They dance in the sky to show us they're free. You didn't know if that was comforting or terrifying. How many prisoners had died on journeys like this? How many spirits might be dancing up there? The lights faded after perhaps 20 minutes. The fire was dying down. Reality returned. You were still in the coldest place on Earth, still weeks from your destination, still struggling to survive. But you'd seen something beautiful that mattered somehow. The final 2 weeks of the journey were the hardest. The temperature dropped even further. One morning, the guards couldn't get an accurate reading because all their thermometers had frozen. Based on other signs, the way sound traveled, the way breath froze, the brittleness of the air itself, they estimated it was minus 65 Celsius, maybe colder. At these temperatures, exposed skin freezes in under a minute. Your body is in constant crisis, burning through every calorie just trying to maintain core temperature. Your brain gets foggy from the cold and the exhaustion. Your movements become slow, clumsy. You're dying. Slowly, and you know it. 3 more prisoners died in those final 2 weeks. 2 from exposure. They simply ran out of energy. Their bodies gave up, and they fell asleep and didn't wake up. The 3rd fell through thin ice on a river crossing. The ice was thick enough for most of the crossing, but there was a weak spot. Wanting a weak spot. He went through and disappeared under the ice before anyone could react. The current swept him away under the frozen surface. They didn't even recover his body. You helped Dmitri, the young man with the frostbitten feet, through those final weeks. It was harder now. He could barely walk. You and Ivan took turns supporting him, letting him lean on you. It cost you both dearly. Your own strength was failing, but you'd come this far together. You weren't going to let him die now. Not when the destination was so close. And then, finally, on a gray afternoon in what you thought was late February, though you'd lost track of the exact date, you saw it. Through the blowing snow and the fog that hung in the air, you saw wooden buildings. A settlement. The convoy had reached Verkhoyansk, your destination, your home for the next 5 years. Your prison. Chapter 5, where the thermometer dies. Verkhoyansk appeared out of the fog like something from another world, which, in a sense, it was. This was the pole of cold, one of the two coldest permanently inhabited places on Earth. The other, Onyakan, was only about 600 kilometers away. Together, they formed a region so hostile to human life that it seemed impossible anyone could survive here. But people did survive here. People lived here. And now, so would you. The settlement was small, much smaller than you'd expected. Maybe 100 wooden buildings scattered along the frozen Yana River. Most were simple one-room structures, unpainted wood darkened by weather and time. A few larger buildings stood out, probably administrative offices, a church, storage facilities. Everything was covered in a thick layer of frost and ice. Icicles hung from every roof, some of them several meters long. The entire settlement sat in a valley, surrounded by low hills. This topography was part of what made it so cold. In winter, cold air, which is heavier than warm air, sinks into the valley and pools there, trapped by the hills. The cold accumulates, gets colder, has nowhere to go. It just sits there, deepening, intensifying. The convoy stopped in front of a larger building near the center of the settlement. This was the Ostrog, the prison administration building. The guards dismounted, and prisoners were ordered off the sleds. You climbed down stiffly. Your legs barely worked after weeks of sitting or walking. Everything hurt. A man emerged from the building, wrapped in furs, his face barely visible behind layers of cloth. He was the commandant, the official in charge of the exile settlement. He looked at the prisoners with the same expression the guards had worn throughout the journey. Bored, indifferent, seeing problems rather than people. "Welcome to Verkhoyansk," he said, his voice muffled by his wrappings. "The coldest place on Earth. You'll be here for the duration of your sentences. You'll work, you'll follow orders, and if you're lucky, you'll survive." Questions? No one had questions. What would be the point? Good. Follow me. Nano Osi. King Hailasi. Etalrind. Algol Kakar. He led the group to another building, longer and lower than the administration building. This was the barracks where you'd live. The prisoners shuffled inside, desperate to get out of the cold. The barracks was dark. There were small windows, but they were covered with a thick layer of frost, inside and out, that blocked most light. Your eyes adjusted slowly. The building was one long room, with wooden sleeping platforms along the walls. No beds, just bare wooden planks. There was a stove in the center, a crude metal cylinder with a pipe leading up through the roof. The stove was cold, not lit. "You'll receive your rations once daily," the commandant said. "Bread, tea, occasionally fish or meat. You'll be assigned work duties. You'll follow all orders without question. Escape attempts are punishable by death, though in this climate, the cold will kill you before we have to. Any questions now?" Again, silence. The prisoners were too exhausted, too cold, too overwhelmed to speak. "Welcome to your new home," the commandant said, and there might have been dark humor in his voice. Then he left. The guards brought in some firewood and lit the stove. It took time to catch, and even once it was burning, it barely made a dent in the cold. The barracks temperature was probably minus 30 Celsius. Outside, it was minus 55 or worse. So technically, the barracks was warmer, but it didn't feel warm, not even close. He found a spot on one of the sleeping platforms and sat down. The wood was so cold it hurt to touch even through your clothing. You looked around at the other prisoners. Everyone had the same expression. Exhausted, defeated, barely clinging to consciousness. Dmitri sat down next to you. His feet were in terrible shape. The frostbite had worsened during the final weeks of travel. He'd probably lose at least 3 toes, maybe more. But he'd survived. You'd helped him survive. Thank you, he said quietly. Just those 2 words. You nodded. You were too tired to speak. Over the next few days, you learned about life in Verkhoyansk. The settlement existed primarily to house exiles, political prisoners like yourself, criminals, and people who'd been banished from other parts of Russia for various offenses. There were perhaps 200 exiles here, plus about 50 guards and administrators, and maybe 100 Yakut natives who'd lived in the region for generations. The Yakuts were remarkable. They'd adapted to this climate over centuries, developing clothing and housing and survival techniques that allowed them to not just survive, but actually live here year-round. They wore multi-layered clothing made from reindeer fur and leather. Their boots, called high boots, were made from reindeer leg skin and stuffed with dried grass for insulation. They knew how to read the weather, how to travel safely, how to find food even in winter. The exiles had none of this knowledge and none of this equipment. You had your worn coat, your inadequate boots, and whatever you could improvise from available materials. The work assignments came the next day. You were assigned to wood cutting duty. This meant going into the forest, such as it was, and cutting down trees for firewood. The settlement used enormous amounts of firewood. Every building needed heating, and in temperatures this extreme, the stoves burned through wood at an alarming rate. The work was hard, dangerous, and had to be done regardless of temperature. You would go out with a group of other prisoners, escorted by guards, and you'd chop trees and haul them back to the settlement. The physical labor actually helped, in a way. Moving kept you warmer than sitting still, but it also burned calories you couldn't afford to burn. The rations were barely adequate. Each prisoner received about 800 grams of black bread per day, weak tea, and occasionally, maybe twice a week, a small portion of fish or meat. This wasn't enough for someone doing heavy physical labor in extreme cold. Your body needed perhaps 4,000 calories per day to maintain its temperature and energy. You were getting maybe 1,500. You lost more weight. Everyone did. Within a month, you could see the physical deterioration in yourself and the other prisoners. Faces became gaunt. Bodies became skeletal. Eyes sank into their sockets. But you adapted slowly. You learned tricks. You learned to wrap yourself in every available piece of cloth or hide. You learned to sleep packed closely with other prisoners, sharing body heat. You learned to eat slowly, savoring every bite, trying to extract every bit of nutrition and warmth from the meager food. You learned the warning signs of frostbite, the numbness, the white patches on skin, the way tissue would turn black if it got bad enough. You learned to check your fingers and toes daily, warming them, making sure blood was still flowing. You learned that metal was the enemy. Never touch metal with bare skin. Ever. Not even for a second. Metal at -50 or -60 would freeze your skin instantly. You'd lose skin, maybe whole fingers. You learned that moisture was deadly. If you sweated while working, that moisture would freeze when you stopped moving. Frozen moisture against your skin would lower your body temperature rapidly. So you learned to work steadily, but not hard enough to sweat. A difficult balance. You learned that wind was more dangerous than cold. -40 with no wind was survivable. -40 with strong wind could kill you in minutes. Wind stripped away the thin layer of warm air that your body tried to maintain around your skin. The technical term is wind chill, but the locals just called it the wind that kills. Most importantly, you learned to recognize the fog, the famous Verkhoyansk fog that could reduce visibility to just a few meters. The fog formed when moisture in the air froze, creating tiny ice crystals suspended in the air. It was thickest in the coldest weather, When the fog came, you couldn't see more than an arm's length in front of you. Getting lost in the fog meant death. You could wander in circles, unable to find your way back to the settlement until exhaustion or cold killed you. There were stories, told and whispered in the barracks at night, of prisoners who'd gotten lost in the fog. They'd gone out to work and never returned. Sometimes their bodies were found in spring, just meters from the settlement. They'd been so close to safety but couldn't see it through the fog. One night, perhaps 6 weeks after your arrival, you lay on your wooden platform, wrapped in every scrap of cloth you owned, packed between Dmitri and Ivan for warmth. The stove was still burning, casting flickering shadows on the walls. Outside, the wind moaned around the building. Someone asked the question everyone was thinking: how do we survive 5 years of this? No one had an answer. 5 years seemed impossible. 5 months seemed impossible. 5 weeks, which you'd already done, seemed like a miracle. But you'd survived so far. 3 months of travel through the coldest landscape on Earth. 6 weeks in Verkhoyansk itself. You were still alive. Your toes and fingers were still attached. You hadn't given up. Maybe, just maybe, you could survive 5 years. Or maybe you'd die trying. Out here, in the pole of cold, those were the only 2 options. Either way, you'd find out. Chapter 6. The Architecture of Survival. Living in Verkhoyansk meant understanding the buildings, or rather, understanding why the buildings failed. Because unlike modern Yakutsk with its engineering solutions, heated garages, buildings on stilts, double-glazed windows, insulated pipes, the exile settlement of the 1880s had none of that. The buildings were simple wooden structures, and in the extreme cold, they became prisons within a prison. The barracks where you slept was typical of exile housing. It was perhaps 20 meters long and 6 meters wide, constructed from logs laid horizontally and chinked with moss and mud. The roof was made of wooden shingles, covered with earth and snow. There were 6 small windows, each about 30 centimeters square, covered with oiled animal membrane instead of glass. Glass was too expensive and too fragile for this climate. The fundamental problem was that the building had been constructed using techniques designed for normal climates. But Verkhoyansk was not a normal climate. At minus 60 Celsius, things happened that the builders hadn't anticipated. The logs would contract in the extreme cold, creating gaps between them. The chinked moss and mud would dry out and fall away, leaving cracks that let in the outside air. The roof would accumulate snow, sometimes a meter deep or more, which actually helped with insulation. But the weight could cause the roof to sag, or even collapse. Most bizarrely, ice would form inside the building. Not just frost on the windows, but actual ice on the walls. The building had one stove that could never heat the entire space evenly. The air near the stove might get up to around 0 Celsius on a good day, but the far corners of the building stayed well below freezing, maybe minus 20 or minus 30. Any moisture in the air, from breathing, from cooking, from the tea kettle, would freeze when it contacted the cold walls. Over the course of the winter, a layer of ice would build up, sometimes several centimeters thick. The walls would sparkle in the dim light, covered in hoarfrost and ice. This created a vicious cycle. The ice on the walls made the building colder, which caused more moisture to freeze, which made more ice. By late winter, the inside walls would be completely covered in white, frozen condensation. You could scrape it off with your fingernail, which some prisoners did, eating the ice to get moisture when water was hard to come by. The sleeping platforms were another problem. They were just wooden boards, maybe 3 centimeters thick, raised about 30 centimeters off the floor. No mattresses, no padding. You slept directly on the wood. Wood is a decent insulator compared to metal or stone, but at these temperatures, Even wood pulled heat from your body. Lying down on the platform felt like lying on a block of ice. The cold would seep up through your clothing, through your blanket, directly into your bones. This is why prisoners slept packed together like sardines. A platform designed for maybe 8 people would have 12 or 15 bodies crammed onto it. You'd sleep on your side, pressed against the person in front of you and behind you. There was no privacy, no personal space, but the collective body heat made survival possible. The stove was the heart of the barracks, literally the source of life. It was a crude metal cylinder, perhaps a meter tall and half a meter in diameter, with a door on the front for feeding in wood and a pipe going up through the roof to vent smoke. The stove was never allowed to go completely cold. Even at night, someone would keep a small fire going, but keeping the fire going was a constant challenge. The wood you'd cut during work duty was frozen solid. Frozen wood doesn't burn well. It needs to thaw first, so wood would be stacked near the stove to dry out and warm up before being fed into the fire. This meant the area immediately around the stove was always crowded with drying wood. Prisoners trying to warm up, wet clothes being dried, tea being made. The pipe that vented smoke through the roof was another problem. In extreme cold, creosote from the smoke would freeze inside the pipe, building up and restricting airflow. The pipe needed to be cleaned regularly, or the stove would smoke into the building instead of venting outside. Cleaning the pipe meant going up on the icy roof in whatever temperature was happening that day. -40, -50, -60. It was dangerous, miserable work. The windows, covered with oiled membrane, let in almost no light. Even during the brief daylight hours, 3 or 4 hours of weak gray light in January and February, the interior of the barracks was dim. The ice that built up on both sides of the membrane made it even darker. You lived in perpetual twilight, never quite sure if it was day or night, relying on the guard's schedule to know when to wake, when to work, when to sleep. The door was another weak point. It was just wooden planks held together with iron straps and hinges. It didn't seal well. Cold air would leak in around the edges every time the door opened, which happened frequently as prisoners came and went for work duties, latrine use, or firewood collection. A wave of extreme cold would flood into the building. You learned to dread the door opening. You'd be huddled near the stove, finally starting to feel almost warm, and then someone would open the door. The temperature would drop instantly. Your exposed skin would tighten. The small bit of warmth you'd accumulated would be stripped away, and it would take 15 or 20 minutes for the building to warm back up again. The latrine situation was particularly grim. There was no indoor plumbing, obviously. The latrine was a separate small building, about 30 meters from the barracks. Just a wooden shed with a hole cut in a bench and a pit dug below. In summer, this would have been unpleasant but functional. In winter, at -60, it was a horror. You'd wake in the night needing to use the latrine. You'd have to unwrap yourself from your coverings, put on your boots, wrap your face, and go outside into the lethal cold. The walk to the latrine was dangerous. The fog, the darkness, the wind, any of these could disorient you. People had gotten lost trying to find the latrine at night. Inside the latrine, you'd expose yourself as little as possible, do your business as quickly as possible, and hurry back. The entire process might take 5 minutes. But in that 5 minutes, you'd lose much of your body heat. It would take an hour to warm up again after returning to the barracks. Some prisoners simply wouldn't go out at night. They use a bucket in the corner of the barracks instead. This created its own problems. The smell, the mess, but it was safer than going outside. The Yakut natives in the settlement had their own housing, and it was noticeably better designed. Their homes were partially underground, dug into the earth about a meter deep, then built up with logs. This meant they were insulated by the earth itself. The roofs were thick with sod and snow. The doors had double entries, a kind of airlock that prevented cold air from flooding in when someone entered. Most impressively, they had what they called a cold trap, a slightly lower room right by the entrance where the coldest air would sink, keeping it away from the main living space. Their stoves were also better designed, with more mass, built partially from stone and clay that would absorb heat and radiate it slowly, providing more even, longer-lasting warmth. The exiles had none of these advantages. You had a wooden box with gaps in it, an inadequate stove, and your own body heat. That was all. You learned to appreciate the smallest improvements. Finding a piece of hide or cloth to wrap around yourself was a treasure. Getting a spot on the sleeping platform, closer to the stove, was valuable enough that people would trade favors for it. Having a dry pair of foot wraps, the cloth strips that served as socks, was a luxury. One prisoner, a man named Alexei, who'd been in Verkhoyansk for 2 years before you arrived, had developed an elaborate system for survival. He collected scraps of fur and hide and sewn them into a kind of sleeping bag. He'd fashioned a hood from an old blanket. He had 3 layers of foot wraps that he rotated, drying one pair while wearing another and keeping a third warm in his clothing. Alexei had also mentally mapped the entire barracks for temperature zones. He knew which sleeping spots were warmest, which were in the worst drafts, how to position yourself relative to the stove for maximum warmth without blocking others. He survived 2 winters. That made him an expert. Prisoners would ask his advice, trade with him for materials, learn from his techniques. But even Alexei had paid a price. He'd lost 3 toes to frostbite in his first winter. He walked with a limp. His hands were scarred from cold injuries. His face was weathered, aged beyond his years. Survival was possible, but it came at a cost. The administrative buildings were somewhat better. The commandant's office and quarters, the guards' barracks, the storage buildings. These had better stoves, thicker walls, more attention to construction. The guards still suffered from the cold, but they had better clothing, better food, and could rotate to warmer regions after a year or 2 of service. For them, Verkhoyansk was temporary. For you, it was 5 years. Minimum. You learned to see the buildings not as shelter, but as slightly less deadly versions of the outside. The barracks might be -20 when the outside was -60. That 40-degree difference was the margin between survival and death. But it wasn't comfort. It wasn't safety. It was just slower dying instead of faster dying. The church in the settlement was the best-built structure. It was Russian Orthodox, with the traditional onion dome on top, built from logs but more carefully constructed than the other buildings. Better chinked, better sealed, with a proper brick stove. Services were held on Sundays and holy days. Attendance was technically optional for prisoners, but most went, not because of religious devotion necessarily, but because the church was warmer than the barracks. Standing in the church during a service, packed in with other prisoners and some of the guards and administrators, you could almost feel warm. The collective body heat of perhaps 80 people, the brick stove throwing real heat, the absence of drafts, it was the warmest you'd felt since Moscow. The priest would deliver his sermon in Russian, talking about suffering and redemption, about how earthly trials prepared the soul for heaven. You wondered if he believed it. He was here by choice, sent by the church to minister to the exiles. He had a better house than the prisoners, better food, better everything. But he was still here, in the pole of cold, living in temperatures that could kill. After the service, leaving the church was agonizing. You'd step from relative warmth back into the -50 or -60 cold. Your body would protest, your skin would tighten, and you'd hurry back to the barracks to huddle by the stove. Time in the barracks moved strangely. The darkness, the cold, the monotony, it all blurred together. Days felt like weeks. Weeks felt like days. You'd lose track of time, lose track of yourself. You'd stare at the ice on the walls, watching the frost patterns form and grow, and realize an hour had passed and you hadn't moved. This was another danger of Verkhoyansk. Not just the physical cold, but the psychological cold. The way the environment numbed your mind as well as your body. The way it made you passive, listless, unable to think or plan or hope. Some prisoners gave in to this. They'd stop participating in the small routines of barracks life. Stop talking. Stop eating unless forced. Stop caring. They'd lie on the sleeping platform and stare at nothing. Within weeks, they'd be dead. Not from cold or hunger necessarily, but from giving up. The body following where the mind had already gone. You fought against this by maintaining small routines. Every morning, you'd check your fingers and toes for frostbite. You'd make yourself eat all your ration, no matter how tired or depressed you felt. You'd talk to Dmitri and Ivan, forcing conversation even when you didn't feel like it. You'd help others when you could, because helping others gave you purpose beyond mere survival. The buildings of Verkhoyansk were inadequate, poorly designed for the climate, barely sufficient for survival. But they were what you had. And so you adapted, you improvised, you endured. Because the alternative was freezing to death in a wooden box at the coldest place on Earth. And you weren't ready to die yet. Chapter 7. The Daily Freeze. Morning in Verkhoyansk didn't arrive with sunrise. In the depths of winter, the sun barely cleared the horizon, providing only a few hours of weak, gray light that could barely be called daylight. You'd wake not because of light, but because of sound. The guards banging on the barracks door, shouting that it was time to work. Waking up was its own kind of torture. You'd been sleeping packed between other prisoners, cocooned in whatever warmth your collective body heat could generate. Your breath had frozen on the cloth you'd wrapped around your face to protect it while sleeping. Your eyelashes were stuck together with ice. You'd have to warm them with your hand before you could fully open your eyes. The temperature in the barracks had dropped overnight. The fire in the stove had burned down to embers. It was probably -30 or colder inside. Your muscles were stiff, reluctant to move. Everything hurt. Your back from sleeping on hard wood, your joints from the constant cold, your chest from breathing the frozen air. But you had to get up. Refusing to work meant punishment, reduced rations, time in the punishment cell, a smaller, unheated building, or worse. So you'd unwrap yourself, sit up, and begin the process of preparing for the day. First, check your extremities. Wiggle your toes inside your boots. Flex your fingers. Make sure everything still worked, still had feeling. Look for the telltale white patches that indicated frostbite. If you found any, you'd warm that area immediately, carefully, knowing that frostbitten tissue was easy to lose if you weren't careful. Next, layer up. You'd sleep in most of your clothing to keep it from freezing completely stiff, but now you'd add more layers. More wrappings around your feet, more cloth around your face. Your coat, stiff with cold. Your mittens if you had them, or rags wrapped around your hands if you didn't. The process took 15 or 20 minutes, moving slowly, trying to conserve energy, trying to generate a little warmth through movement before you had to go outside. Breakfast was minimal. A piece of black bread, frozen solid, which you'd hold against your body to soften slightly before eating. Hot tea from the kettle on the stove, weak and barely flavored, but hot. The warmth going down your throat was precious. You'd cup the hot tea in your hands for a moment, absorbing the heat through your palms before drinking. Then, outside. The moment you stepped through the door was always a shock, no matter how many times you did it. The cold hit like a physical force. -50, minus 55 tatori. Sometimes worse. Your breath would freeze instantly into a white cloud around your head. Your nose hairs would freeze. The moisture in your eyes would start to freeze, making your vision blur. The world outside was white and gray. Snow covered everything. The buildings looked like they were melting into the landscape, half buried in drifts. The sky was the color of old iron. And the fog, there was almost always fog in the coldest weather. Thick, white fog that reduced visibility to just a few meters, made from tiny ice crystals suspended in the air. You'd report for work duty, lining up with the other prisoners in the bitter cold, while a guard counted heads and assigned tasks. The words came out in bursts of frozen breath. The guards didn't want him to be outside any more than you did. They'd hurry through the count, shout the assignments, and you'd set off toward your work location. Most days, you were assigned to wood cutting. This meant walking to the forest, perhaps 15 or 20 minutes from the settlement, and cutting down trees for firewood. The work party would consist of 10 or 12 prisoners and 2 guards, one leading, one following, to prevent anyone from running off. Not that anyone would. Running away in this climate was suicide. The cold would kill you within hours, maybe minutes if you didn't have proper clothing. The walk to the work site was miserable. The snow squeaked under your feet with that particular high-pitched sound it makes at extreme temperatures. The wind, when it blew, cut through your clothing like it wasn't there. You'd walk with your head down, face wrapped, watching the feet of the person ahead of you, just following, not thinking. At the work site, you'd be given tools. An axe, usually. Weighty, dull, poorly maintained, but functional. Your hands would already be numb with cold, and gripping the wooden handle was difficult. The work itself, chopping down trees, cutting them into manageable lengths, stacking them for later transport, was brutally hard. But there was a strange blessing in it. The physical labor generated heat. As you swung the axe, as you strained and pulled and lifted, your body would warm up slightly. Not enough to be truly warm. You could never be truly warm, but enough that the cold became bearable instead of agonizing. The trick was finding the right pace. Work too hard, and you'd sweat. Sweat was deadly. The moisture would soak into your clothing, and when you stopped moving, it would freeze. Frozen moisture against your skin would suck heat from your body at an alarming rate, dropping your core temperature, bringing you close to hypothermia. But work too slowly, and you wouldn't generate enough heat. You'd start to freeze. Your fingers and toes would go numb. Your movements would become sluggish. Frostbite would set in. So you learned to find the middle ground. Steady work, consistent effort, and enough to stay warm, not enough to sweat. It was a delicate balance, and getting it wrong could kill you. The work went on for hours. The guards would allow brief breaks, 5 minutes to huddle together, to share body warmth, to catch your breath. During these breaks, you'd see the other prisoners' condition, faces reddened and raw from cold exposure, beards and mustaches covered with ice from frozen breath, eyes watering from the cold, tears freezing on cheeks. Conversation during work was minimal. Talking meant exposing your mouth to the cold air. Words came out in brief, clipped sentences. Need help. Trees ready. Watch out. Nothing more. Communication was reduced to the absolute minimum necessary. Dmitri worked near you most days. His feet had never fully recovered from the frostbite during the journey. He'd lost 4 toes, 3 on one foot, 1 on the other. Walking was painful for him, and heavy work was nearly impossible. But he did it anyway, because refusing to work meant starving. You'd help him when you could, taking on some of his tasks, covering for him when the guards weren't watching closely. Even the older man who'd helped you with Dmitri worked steadily despite his age. He was perhaps 50 years old, ancient by exile standards. Most prisoners didn't survive to 50, but Ivan had a kind of stubborn resilience. He'd been in Verkhoyansk for 3 years. He'd learned all the tricks: how to conserve energy, how to avoid the worst frostbite, how to mentally endure the unendurable. You just don't think about the future. Ivan told you once during a break, his words barely audible through his wrappings. Don't think about how much time is left. Don't think about next year. Just think about making it to tonight. Tomorrow morning, you think about making it to tomorrow night. That's all. One day at a time. Oh, sell me under these. It was good advice. Thinking about 5 years was crushing. 5 years of this cold, this work, this suffering. It seemed impossible to survive. But one day, you could survive one day, and then another, and another. String enough days together, and eventually you'd have a week, a month, a year. One day, a prisoner named Mikhail wasn't working at his usual pace. He was moving slowly, sluggishly. His face looked wrong, pale, almost waxy. The guards noticed and shouted at him to work faster. He didn't respond, just kept moving in slow motion. Ivan noticed too. He's hypothermic, Ivan said quietly. His core temperature is dropping. If it gets too low, he'll die. Bueno. You and Ivan stopped your own work and went to Mikhail. He was barely conscious, his eyes unfocused. His hands were blue. He started rubbing his arms and chest, trying to get his blood flowing. He even shouted to the guards that they needed to get Mikhail back to the settlement immediately. The guards were reluctant. If they ended the work shift early, they'd be criticized by their superiors. But Ivan was insistent, and eventually they relented. One guard stayed with the remaining prisoners, while the other helped walk Mikhail back to the settlement, with you and Ivan supporting him on either side. The walk back was agonizing. Mikhail could barely put one foot in front of the other. His body temperature had dropped so low that his muscles weren't functioning properly. You could feel him shivering violently against you, his body's desperate attempt to generate heat. When you reached the barracks and got him inside near the stove, he slowly began to recover. Color returned to his face. His shivering gradually subsided. He'd been minutes away from death, his core temperature dropping into the danger zone where the heart simply stops. "Thank you," he whispered when he could finally speak. You just nodded. Tomorrow, it might be you who needed help. Out here, survival depended on looking out for each other. The rest of the workday continued as always. Chop wood, stack wood, repeat. What? Hours blurred together. The weak daylight, such as it was, came and went. You worked in twilight, then darkness, guided only by the guards' lanterns. Finally, the guards signaled that the workday was over. You gather the tools, make sure everything was accounted for, and begin the walk back to the settlement. This return journey was always harder than the morning walk. You were exhausted now. Your muscles ached. Your body had burned through what little energy the morning's bread and tea had provided. The settlement appeared out of the fog like a promise. Not a promise of comfort. There was no comfort here. But a promise of survival for another night. You'd return the tools to the storage shed, line up for the evening count, and finally be dismissed to the barracks. Inside, you'd immediately move toward the stove. Everyone did. The area around the stove was crowded with prisoners trying to warm up, drying their foot wrappings, melting snow for drinking water. You'd wait your turn, standing in the cold part of the barracks until you could get close enough to feel some heat. The evening meal was the day's main ration. More black bread. Sometimes a thin soup made from whatever was available. Usually just water with a few chunks of turnip or potato, occasionally with a bit of fish. The portions were small, never enough. You'd eat slowly, trying to make it last, trying to fool your body into feeling more satisfied. After eating, there were a few hours before sleep. Some prisoners would talk quietly, sharing stories from their past lives, from before exile. These conversations were precious. They reminded you that you'd once been a person, not just a body struggling to survive. You'd once had a name, a family, a life that meant something. Dmitri would talk about his sister in Moscow, how she'd promised to write, but letters rarely made it this far north. Ivan would reminisce about his work as a clerk in St. Petersburg, the simple pleasure of sitting at a desk in a warm office, writing with a good pen. Another prisoner, a man named Powder, had been a musician. He'd hum melodies sometimes, his voice soft, and for a moment, the barracks would feel less like a prison and more like a place where humans live. You'd share your own memories too. The stove in your old apartment, the taste of proper tea with sugar, the sound of church bells on Sunday mornings, the feel of clean clothes. These memories were painful, but they were also necessary. They reminded you of what you were enduring for, the hope, however distant, of eventual return to warmth and normalcy. As the fire in the stove burned lower, prisoners would begin settling onto the sleeping platforms. There was a ritual to this. The newest prisoners had to take the spots furthest from the stove, the coldest locations. Those who'd been here longest had earned spots closer to the warmth. It was a hierarchy of survival. You'd wrap yourself in your blanket and any other cloth you'd accumulated. You'd press against Dmitri on one side and Ivan on the other. Other prisoners would pack in around and behind you. The platform would be crowded with 12 or 15 bodies where 8 would have been comfortable. But comfort was irrelevant. Warmth was survival. Someone would be assigned to maintain the fire through the night, adding wood every hour or two to keep it from going out completely. This duty rotated among the prisoners. When it was your turn, you'd barely sleep, instead sitting near the stove, feeding it wood, watching the flames, and trying not to think about how many more nights like this stretched ahead of you. The barracks would settle into a pattern of sounds. Snoring, whining, coughing. Almost everyone had a persistent cough from breathing the cold air. Sometimes, someone would cry out in their sleep, lost in a nightmare. The wind outside would moan around the building. The wood would creak and pop from the cold. The fire would hiss and crack, and you'd lie there, neither fully asleep nor fully awake, in that liminal state that becomes normal when you're always cold, always exhausted, all struggling. Your body would hurt. Your feet would throb from the day's walking and working. Your hands would ache. Your chest would feel tight from breathing the frozen air all day. But you were alive. You'd survived another day, and tomorrow you'd do it again. And the day after that, and the day after that. This was your daily life now. Wake in the cold, work in the cold, eat barely enough to survive, sleep in the cold, repeat. No weekends, no vacations, no relief. Just the endless cycle of survival at the coldest inhabited place on Earth. And somewhere in your mind, a small part of you kept counting, one day down day, roughly 1824 to go until your 5-year sentence was complete. If you survived that long. Chapter 8, when breath becomes ice. There's a moment that every exile in Verkoyansk remembers. A moment when you truly understand what extreme cold means. For most people, that moment comes when they see their own breath freeze and fall to the ground like snow. It happened to you on a particularly cold morning, perhaps 2 months into your time in Verkhoyansk. Dot, dot. The temperature that day was estimated at minus 65 Celsius, though the thermometers had long since frozen solid and couldn't measure it accurately. The guards used other methods to gauge temperature, throwing boiling water in the air and watching how fast it froze, listening to the sound of their own breath crystallizing. You stepped outside the barracks for morning work duty. The cold was immediate and absolute, like walking into a wall. You took a breath, exhaled slowly, and watched in fascination and horror as your breath didn't just form a cloud. It froze. Instantly, tiny ice crystals formed in the air in front of your face, making a faint tinkling sound, like tiny bells or breaking glass, as they fell to the ground. The locals called this the whisper of the stars. It was poetically beautiful. It was also terrifying, because if the air was cold enough to freeze your breath before it could disperse, it was cold enough to freeze your lungs if you breathed too deeply. You learned to breathe differently in this extreme cold. Shallow breaths through your nose, warming the air slightly in your nasal passages before it reached your lungs. Never through your mouth, never deeply. Your body had to work constantly to warm the air enough to not damage your lung tissue. The physical effects of breathing air this cold were immediately noticeable. Your throat would feel raw, scraped, sore. Your chest would ache with each breath. You'd cough, trying to clear the irritation. But coughing in this cold was its own form of torture. It exposed your throat and lungs to more frozen air. But breath wasn't the only thing that froze. Your eyelashes would freeze together with the moisture from your eyes. You'd have to blink hard or warm them with your mittened hand to separate them. Your beard and mustache. Everyone had facial hair now. It provided a tiny bit of insulation for your face, would accumulate ice from your breath. The ice would build up over hours, forming a thick, frozen mass that pulled at your skin. At the end of a workday, you'd return to the barracks with half your face hidden behind a mask of ice. You'd have to warm it carefully by the stove to melt it off. If you tried to break it off, you'd pull hair and skin with it. The freezing effect extended to everything. Saliva froze before it hit the ground. You'd learn not to spit, but if you did, you'd hear a sharp crack as the frozen spit shattered on impact. Tears froze on your cheeks. Even the mucus in your nose would freeze, creating an uncomfortable, blocked sensation that made breathing even harder. One of the strangest effects was what happened to metal. At extreme cold, metal becomes brittle and dangerous in ways you wouldn't expect. The iron tools you used for work, axes, saws, shovels, would become so cold that touching them with bare skin, even for a second, would cause instant frostbite. Your skin would freeze to the metal, and pulling away would tear the skin off. You learned this the hard way when you absent-mindedly adjusted your grip on an axe handle during work, your mitten having slipped slightly. Your bare fingertip touched the metal axe head for perhaps 1 second. When you pulled away, you left skin behind, frozen to the metal. The exposed flesh underneath burned with cold and pain. You wrapped it quickly, but it took weeks to heal, and you were lucky not to lose the finger entirely. The guards carried metal rifle parts and had to be careful not to touch them with exposed skin. There were stories, perhaps true, perhaps exaggerated, of guards who touched their rifle barrel with their tongue on a dare and had the tongue freeze to the metal. The only way to free it was to pour warm water over it or tear the tongue away, leaving permanent damage. Even more bizarre was what happened to liquids. Water, obviously, froze solid almost instantly when exposed to this temperature. But other things behaved strangely too. The kerosene used in lanterns would become thick and sluggish, barely flowing. Vodka, which normally doesn't freeze until much colder temperatures, would start to show ice crystals forming in it. The guards kept vodka outside in the cold and would joke that if it started to freeze, they knew it was truly cold out. When you saw vodka with ice in it, you knew you were experiencing temperatures below -55 Celsius at least. Your clothing became a kind of armor against the cold, but it too was affected by the extreme temperatures. The fabric would freeze stiff, losing its flexibility. Your coat would stand up on its own when you took it off. Your boots would be rigid blocks that you'd have to warm by the fire before you could get them on or off. The leather in your boots would crack and split from the cold. The cloth wrappings you used for your feet would freeze into hard, uncomfortable masses. Everything you wore would accumulate moisture from your sweat and breath, and that moisture would freeze, adding weight and reducing the insulation value. There was a constant battle with moisture. Your body produced it through sweat and breath. The barracks produced it through cooking and the tea kettle. That moisture had to go somewhere, and at these temperatures, it went solid. Ice would form on everything, on your clothing, on the walls, on your blanket, even on your hair. Some prisoners' beards would be so thick with ice that they couldn't close their mouths properly. They'd look like frozen statues, their faces hidden behind masks of white frost and ice. At the end of the day, sitting by the stove, ice would melt from their faces in streams, dripping onto the floor, their skin red and raw underneath. The cold also affected your body in ways you hadn't anticipated. Your fingers and toes were always at risk, but other parts suffered too. Your ears would freeze if not properly covered. The tip of your nose was constantly numb. Your lips would crack and bleed from the dry, cold air. The skin on your face would become weathered and damaged, aging you years in just months. Men's beards would sometimes freeze to their coats during the night, frozen in place by their own breath. You'd wake up and find you couldn't move your head without first melting the ice that had formed. Women, the few who were exiled here, had their own struggles. Their longer hair would freeze into stiff ropes, difficult to manage, providing little warmth despite its length. The cold even affected your perception. In extreme cold, sound travels differently. Sometimes sounds would seem muffled, distant. Other times, in very still air, you could hear things from impossibly far away. A dog barking from a kilometer off, someone chopping wood in the distance. The cold air conducted sound in strange ways. Your vision would be affected too. The constant squinting against the cold wind and bright snow would give you headaches. The frozen moisture in your eyelashes would blur your vision. Sometimes the extreme cold would create optical effects, halos around lights, strange distortions in the air, mirages. There was also the psychological effect of seeing your breath freeze. It was a constant, visible reminder of just how hostile the environment was. Every breath you took was trying to kill you. The air itself was your enemy. This awareness never left you. Every moment outside was a battle against a force that wanted you dead. And yet, strangely, you adapted. After months in Verkoyansk, the extreme cold became not normal exactly, but expected. You learned to recognize different degrees of extreme cold. -40 felt almost warm compared to -60. -50 without wind was manageable. -55 with wind was when you had to be most careful. You developed a kind of intimacy with the cold. You understood its moods, its dangers, its subtle variations. You could tell the temperature within a few degrees just by how your breath looked, how your face felt, how the snow sounded under your boots. The old-timers, prisoners who'd been there for years, barely seemed to notice the cold anymore. Or rather, they'd learned to function despite it so completely that it had become part of them. Ivan could work outside for hours with minimal complaint. Alexei, who'd survived 3 winters, claimed he barely felt the cold anymore. His body had adapted to the point where -40 felt comfortable to him. You didn't know if that was adaptation or just damage. Maybe they couldn't feel the cold because their nerve endings had been destroyed by repeated frostbite. Maybe they were lying to maintain morale. Or maybe after enough time in hell, your body and mind simply adjusted to the new reality. One evening, sitting in the barracks with your hands wrapped around a cup of hot tea, you noticed something. Your fingers, which had been so sensitive to cold when you first arrived, were now less responsive. You could touch things that would have caused sharp pain months ago and barely feel them. The chronic exposure to extreme cold was changing you, physically and mentally. You were becoming a creature of the cold, adapted to survive in conditions that would kill most humans. Resilient, hard, damaged, but alive. And every morning, when you stepped outside and watched your breath freeze and fall to the ground like crystallized snow, you were reminded. This place that was slowly killing you was also, in its own strange way, keeping you alive. Because out here, at the pole of cold, adaptation wasn't optional. It was the only way to survive. Chapter 9. The Fog That Blinds. The fog in Verkhoyansk was unlike any fog you'd experienced before. This wasn't the soft, damp fog of Moscow mornings or the misty coastal fog you'd once read about. This was ice fog. Frozen moisture suspended in the air, creating a white void that could swallow the world. It came without warning, usually on the coldest days. You'd be working in the forest, visibility perhaps 50 meters, and then, suddenly the air would thicken. White particles would appear, multiplying, until you couldn't see more than an arm's length in front of you. The world would disappear, replaced by an impenetrable white nothing. The first time you experienced the ice fog, it was terrifying. You were returning from work with a group of prisoners, following a well-worn path back to the settlement. The fog descended quickly, and within minutes, you couldn't see the prisoner walking directly in front of you. The guard at the front of the line shouted for everyone to hold onto each other, forming a chain of bodies connected by gripping the coat of the person ahead. Even with this precaution, the sense of disorientation was overwhelming. You couldn't see the ground beneath your feet. You couldn't see the trees that you knew were just beside the path. You couldn't see anything except white. It was like being blind, except your eyes were open and useless. The guard at the front navigated by memory, counting steps, feeling for familiar landmarks, a particular tree, a large rock, a depression in the snow. But even experienced guides could get lost in ice fog. The white emptiness erased all reference points, all sense of direction. You shuffled forward, gripping Dmitri's coat in front of you, feeling Ivan's grip on your own coat from behind. The line moved slowly, tentatively. Someone stumbled. The line jerked. The guard shouted something, his voice muffled and strange in the thick fog. Time lost meaning. You might have been walking for 5 minutes or an hour. The repetitive crunching of footsteps in snow, the white void, the cold, it all blurred together. Your mind played tricks. You'd think you saw shapes in the fog, buildings, people, trees that weren't there, just patterns in the white, your brain trying to make sense of senselessness. Finally, after what felt like forever, darker shapes began to emerge from the fog. Buildings, the settlement. You'd made it back. The guard counted heads, confirming everyone had survived the journey. Everyone had. This time, but not everyone was always so lucky. You heard the stories whispered in the barracks at night. Prisoners who'd gotten separated in the fog and were found frozen days later, just meters from the settlement. They'd been circling, disoriented, until exhaustion and cold took them. Some were never found at all. At least, not until spring thaw revealed their bodies. The fog formed when extreme cold met moisture, breath from animals and people, smoke from chimneys, open water from rare unfrozen springs. Any source of moisture would instantly freeze in the extreme cold, creating billions of tiny ice crystals that hung suspended in the still air. The colder it got, the thicker the fog became. At -60 or colder, the fog could be so dense you couldn't see your hand in front of your face. It would coat everything in a layer of delicate frost. Your eyelashes, your coat, exposed hair, all would become encrusted with fine, white ice crystals. The fog also created strange acoustic effects. Sounds would be deadened, absorbed by the billions of ice particles. You could be standing next to someone and barely hear their voice. Yet sometimes, inexplicably, you'd hear distant sounds clearly. A door closing, someone coughing, the bark of a dog. As if the fog channeled sound in unpredictable ways. Walking through ice fog was sensory deprivation while moving. You could see nothing, hear little, feel only cold. Your sense of balance would falter. Without visual references, you'd start to feel dizzy, unsure if you were walking straight or veering off course. Some people would close their eyes while walking in fog. It made no difference, and somehow it was less disorienting than staring into the white void. The guards developed protocols for fog days. Work parties would not be sent out if fog was too thick. The risk of losing prisoners wasn't worth it. Not out of compassion, but because losing prisoners meant paperwork and potential blame. Better to keep everyone in the settlement, huddled in buildings, waiting for the fog to clear. But fog could last for days. During these periods, the settlement became even more claustrophobic. Everyone trapped inside, the barracks overcrowded, tempers fraying. You couldn't see more than a few meters outside the windows, which were themselves frosted over. So the world might as well have ended at the edges of the settlement. Dmitri found fog days particularly hard. He was naturally claustrophobic, and being trapped in the barracks with dozens of other men, unable to see outside, unable to know when it would end, made him anxious. He'd pace near the stove, his damaged feet making his gait uneven, muttering to himself. You'd sit with him during these times, talking quietly, trying to distract him from the oppressive closeness. You'd tell stories from your life before exile, or make up stories, imaginary journeys to warm places, descriptions of spring days, anything to create mental space when physical space was so constrained. Ivan had a different relationship with the fog. He'd grown almost meditative about it. "The fog is honest," he said once. "It doesn't pretend to be anything but what it is. Dangerous. Absolute. Most things in life hide their true nature. The fog doesn't." You weren't sure if that was wisdom or just the rambling of a man who'd been in exile too long. But there was something to it. The fog was pure in its way. Pure cold, pure danger, pure survival challenge. No politics, no lies, no pretense. Just you and nature, stripped of everything else. The Yakut natives handled fog differently. They'd grown up with it, lived with it for generations. They had techniques for navigating in zero visibility, counting steps, using the wind direction, following the sun's faint glow, even when it couldn't be seen directly. They'd tie ropes between buildings during bad fog so they could move safely between structures without getting lost. The exiles tried to learn these techniques, but it wasn't easy. The Yakut's knowledge was generational, learned from childhood. You were trying to learn in months what they'd absorbed over lifetimes. Some prisoners picked it up better than others. Those who didn't often paid with frostbite or worse. There was a particularly bad fog period in your second winter in Verkhoyansk. It lasted nearly a week. Fog so thick, that visibility was genuinely zero. You couldn't see your hand at arm's length. The settlement essentially shut down. Work stopped. Everyone stayed inside except for necessary trips to get firewood or use the latrine. During this fog week, supplies began to run low. Firewood died. Food, food. Water, dot. The settlement normally had plenty stored, but the extended fog period stretched resources. Rations were reduced. The firewood allocation to the prisoners' barracks was cut. The temperature inside dropped. On the fourth day of fog, a prisoner named Grigory decided he couldn't take it anymore. He was suffering from what we'd now call severe cabin fever, anxiety, agitation, an overwhelming need to escape the enclosed space. Despite warnings, despite everyone telling him not to, he went outside. He said he was just going to walk around the barracks, stay close to the building. He'd be able to follow the wall back, he said. It would be fine. He disappeared into the white void. Within seconds, you couldn't see him anymore. Within a minute, his footsteps in the snow were invisible, covered by the fog. Everyone waited inside, listening. There were shouts. Grigory calling out, his voice muffled and directionally ambiguous. Then more shouts, further away as he wandered farther from the barracks, disoriented, unable to find his way back. Some prisoners wanted to go after him. The guards refused. They wouldn't risk more people getting lost. The fog was too thick. All you could do was listen to Grigory's shouts, growing fainter, more distant, more desperate. Then silence. His body was found 3 days later when the fog finally cleared. He was approximately 50 meters from the barracks. He'd been going in circles, slowly moving away from safety instead of toward it. He died from exposure, curled up in the snow, probably never knowing he was so close to survival. The fog had claimed another victim, and everyone in the barracks had heard him die, unable to help, powerless against the white void that had swallowed him. After that, no one went outside during thick fog. Not for any reason. You'd rather suffer in the barracks, the crowding, the smell, the reduced rations, than risk the fog. It was one of the few absolute rules that everyone followed. The fog became a presence in your mind, something you thought about, even on clear days. You'd wake and immediately assess the visibility. You'd plan your movements, your work, your survival around the possibility of fog. It was always there, lurking, waiting for the right combination of cold and moisture to materialize and erase the world. In some ways, the fog was more frightening than the cold. Cold could kill you, but at least you could see it coming. You knew when you were getting too cold, when frostbite was starting, when hypothermia was approaching. You had warning signs, however brief. The fog gave no warning. One moment you could see, the next, you were lost in a white void where death could come quickly, silently, invisibly. You could be a meter from safety and never know it. You could die calling for help while people listened helplessly, unable to guide you back, unable to save you. The fog taught you fear in a way the cold never did. It taught you humility. It taught you that nature here didn't just want you dead. It wanted you erased, swallowed, disappeared without a trace. And on the clearest days, when you could see across the settlement to the hills beyond, when the air was sharp and visibility was perfect, you'd still feel the fog's presence. Waiting. Patient. Dot. Inevitable. Because at the pole of cold, the fog always came back. Chapter 10. The things you learn. Survival in Verkhoyansk wasn't just about enduring. It was about learning. About acquiring knowledge that seemed absurd until it saved your life. About developing instincts that went against every comfortable assumption you'd ever had about how the world worked. The veterans, prisoners who'd been in Verkhoyansk for multiple years, were walking repositories of survival wisdom. They'd learned through trial and error, through watching others succeed or fail, through their own near deaths and lucky escapes. And slowly, gradually, they shared this knowledge with newcomers like yourself. Some lessons were simple. Never touch metal with bare skin. Keep your feet moving even when standing still. Breathe through your nose, not your mouth. These basics could save fingers, toes, lungs. But other lessons were more subtle, more complex. The kind of knowledge that only came from living in extreme cold for extended periods. Alexei was perhaps the best teacher. 3 winters in Verkhoyansk had turned him into something between a prisoner and a professional survivor. He knew things that seemed like magic until he explained them. Watch the animals, he told you one evening. They know better than we do. He pointed to a raven sitting on the roof of the barracks. The bird had fluffed its feathers to enormous size, creating air pockets for insulation. It sat motionless, conserving energy. When the bird stopped moving, the cold is dangerous even for them. When you see ravens or hawks just sitting, not flying, you know it's below -50. When you don't see any birds at all, it's below -60. They hide in the forest, in holes in trees, anywhere with shelter. If the birds won't fly, you shouldn't work outside. Or me. Here, you learn to watch the horses too. Horses were incredibly sensitive to temperature changes. You could tell how cold it was by how the horses behaved. At -30, they were active but cautious. At -40, they moved reluctantly. At -50, they stood absolutely still, minimizing movement, their breath creating huge clouds of fog around their heads. If a horse refuses to move, don't force it, Ivan warned. The horse knows something you don't. Either a storm is coming, or the cold is deadly. Listen to the horses. No, one for me. You learned about clothing in ways that seemed counterintuitive. Tighter wasn't always warmer. In fact, tight clothing could be dangerous because it restricted blood flow to extremities. Loose layers with air trapped between them provided better insulation than tight, heavy clothing. Your clothes should feel almost baggy, Alexei explained. The air between layers is what keeps you warm, not the fabric itself. That's why the Yakuts wear such loose-fitting garments. Nestanen. Besfori yimtameshio. Aranadai wow. You learned that wool was superior to cotton in every way. Cotton absorbed moisture and lost its insulating properties when wet. Wool remained somewhat insulating, even when damp. This was why the prison-issue wool coats, despite being threadbare and worn, were preferable to anything made from cotton or linen. Foot wraps, the cloth strips wrapped around your feet inside your boots, had to be changed or at least rotated daily. You'd wear one pair while keeping another pair drying by the stove and a third pair warming inside your clothing. The rotation kept your feet as dry as possible, which prevented frostbite. Wet feet are dead feet, was how Ivan put it. In this cold, moisture is the enemy. Always. Everywhere. Once and daily. You learn to recognize the early signs of frostbite in yourself and others. The progression was predictable. First, numbness. Then, white or grayish-yellow skin. Then skin that felt unnaturally hard or waxy. If caught early, frostbite could be reversed. You'd warm the affected area slowly, never with direct heat, which could cause more damage, usually by placing it against warm skin. Your armpit was ideal for warming frost-bitten fingers. Another person's stomach could warm frost-bitten toes. But if frostbite progressed too far, the tissue would die. It would turn black, mummified, eventually falling off on its own if it wasn't surgically removed. You'd seen this happen to multiple prisoners. Dimitri's toes, another man's fingers, a third prisoner's nose. Literally, his nose had frozen, died, and fallen off, leaving a horrifying gap in his face. You learned that sleeping was a skill in these conditions. The wrong position could trap cold air around you. The right position, curled slightly with your arms tucked close to your body, conserved heat. Never sleep flat on your back. It exposed too much surface area to the cold. Never sleep on your stomach. It restricted breathing. Side sleeping, slightly fetal, packed closely with others. That was optimal. You learned to eat differently. In extreme cold, your body burned through calories at an alarming rate, just maintaining core temperature. You needed fat more than anything else. Butter, lard, fatty fish. These were more valuable than bread or vegetables. Fat provided concentrated energy and helped maintain body temperature. Fat is warmth you can eat, Alexei said. It's worth trading anything for it. This led to an underground economy in the barracks. Prisoners would trade their bread rations for someone else's fatty fish. They'd save butter from the rare occasions it appeared and consume it plain, straight, because it was pure energy. Some prisoners made pacts with the cook, trading favors or whatever they had for extra portions of the fattiest foods. You learned about snow, which wasn't as simple as you thought. Not all snow was the same. Fresh powder was light and provided decent insulation. Old compacted snow was harder and conducted cold more readily. Wet snow, rare in this climate but occasionally present during warmer periods, was the worst, conducting heat away from your body rapidly. You could eat snow for hydration, but only in small amounts and only after warming it in your mouth first. Eating large quantities of snow would lower your core temperature dangerously. The energy your body spent melting and warming the snow was greater than the hydration value you received. There were survival tricks that seemed almost occult until you understood the physics. For instance, if you were caught outside during extreme cold with inadequate clothing, you could create an emergency shelter by digging into a snowdrift. The snow itself, despite being frozen water, actually provided insulation. A snow cave could be 20 or 30 degrees warmer than the outside air. Snow is strange, Ivan explained. It's cold, but it also protects from cold. The Yakuts build temporary shelters from snow when they're traveling. It can save your life. You learn to recognize hypothermia in others and in yourself. The progression was insidious. First came shivering, the body's attempt to generate heat through muscle activity. Then confusion, slurred speech, clumsy movements. Then apathy, a dangerous lack of concern about your situation. Finally, the paradoxical undressing that marked severe hypothermia. Victims would actually remove their clothing, feeling irrationally hot as their bodies shut down. If someone stops shivering, but they're still out in the cold, they're dying, Alexei warned. Shivering means the body is still fighting. No, shivering means they've given up. You have maybe minutes to warn them. You learn strange, specific knowledge, like how to test if water would freeze instantly or not by listening to it. When you poured water on snow at extreme temperatures, it would make a hissing, crackling sound as it flash froze. The speed and sound told you the approximate temperature. Slow freezing with gentle crackling meant -30 or 40. Instant freezing with sharp cracking meant -50 or colder. You learned that fires behave differently in extreme cold. The smoke would rise only a short distance before freezing and falling back down. Flames seemed smaller, weaker. Wood would crack and pop more violently as trapped moisture flash boiled and expanded. Even starting a fire was harder. Matches would sometimes refuse to light, the chemical reactions sluggish in the cold. The Yakuts had a technique for making fire in any weather. They'd carry a small container of birch bark shavings and dried moss, kept warm inside their clothing. These materials, already warm and dry, would catch even in extreme cold. Once you had a small flame going, you could gradually add larger materials. You learned about wind direction and what it meant. In Verkhoyansk, wind patterns were somewhat predictable. Wind from the north brought the coldest air, direct from the Arctic Ocean, unobstructed across the tundra. Wind from the south might bring slightly warmer air from the mountains. Knowing it all meant the coldest temperatures, as cold air pooled and stagnated in the valley. Learn to feel the wind even through your wrappings, Alexei advised. It tells you which way to travel in fog or darkness. It tells you when weather is changing. Wind is information. Nyash. Shi. Tor. Game soul. Anai tor. Soul. You learn psychological survival techniques too. How to maintain hope when everything was hopeless. How to find small pleasures in the midst of suffering. How to build mental routines that gave structure to days that otherwise blurred into meaningless repetition. Pick something small to look forward to each day, Ivan suggested. For me, it's the evening tea. I tell myself, just make it to tea time, and that's enough. Tomorrow, I'll do the same. Small goals, small victories. String enough of them together, and you've survived a year. Wow. You learned the importance of community. Lone wolves didn't survive in Verkhoyansk. The prisoners who isolated themselves, who refused to help others or accept help, who kept to themselves, they died. The ones who formed bonds, who shared resources, who looked out for each other, they had a chance. We're all dying here, Dmitri said once, but we die slower together than alone. This simple truth became the foundation of survival. You shared warmth, shared food, shared knowledge. When someone was struggling, others would help. When you were struggling, help would come. Not always. Not from everyone, but enough. Enough to make survival possible. You learn to recognize the signs of someone giving up. The vacant stare, the lack of interest in food, the withdrawal from conversation. These were danger signs as serious as frostbite. A person who'd given up mentally would die soon after, even if their body was still functioning. Talk to them, Alexei advised. Force them to engage. Make them angry if you have to. Anger is better than apathy. Anger means they still care about something. Wow. You used this technique on a young prisoner named Pavel, who'd started showing signs of giving up. You'd deliberately take his spot near the stove, provoking him to argue with you. You'd challenge him, annoy him, anything to get a reaction. It worked. What? The anger pulled him back from the edge, gave him something to focus on besides despair. You learned about time and how it worked differently here. Clock time continued normally. Seconds, minutes, hours. But psychological time became elastic, distorted. A day of hard work could feel like a week. A week trapped inside during fog could feel like a month. Your 5-year sentence felt simultaneously like an eternity and like something that might be survivable if you just didn't think about it. Don't count the days, Ivan counseled. Don't mark them off. Don't calculate how much time is left. Just exist. Day by day. The counting will drive you mad. Now, nay. You learn practical skills that had never mattered in your previous life. How to repair boots with scraps of leather and sinew. How to sew basic stitches to patch clothing. How to sharpen a dull blade. How to start a fire with damp wood. These weren't hobbies or interesting skills. They were survival necessities. The Yakut natives were the ultimate teachers, though they rarely interacted directly with the exiles. You'd watch them from a distance, observing their techniques, their clothing, their methods of travel and shelter. Everything they did had purpose, efficiency born from generations of knowledge. You noticed how they walked differently in deep cold, Shorter steps, deliberate placement, conserving energy. How they breathed, slowly, evenly, warming air in their mouths before inhaling through their noses. How they dressed, multiple loose layers, with the outer layers slightly oversized to trap air. You learned that survival wasn't heroic. It wasn't dramatic. It was small, repeated actions. Checking your feet every day. Eating all your rations even when you weren't hungry. Keeping your sleeping area organized. Maintaining your clothing. Helping others when you could. Accepting help when you needed it. Survival is boring, Alexei said once. That's the secret. It's not exciting. It's just doing the same small things correctly, over and over, until enough time passes that you're still alive. Nusia. You learn to find moments of beauty, even here. The way frost formed on windows in intricate patterns. The quality of light during the brief midday glow. The sound of snow falling in the rare moments of complete silence. The northern lights dancing across the night sky, green and white, and sometimes red, rippling like curtains in a cosmic wind. These moments didn't make the suffering bearable, exactly, but they reminded you that the world contained more than just cold and hardship. There was still beauty, still wonder, still reasons to want to survive beyond mere biological imperative. You learned that the human body was more resilient than you'd imagined, but also more fragile. You could endure temperatures that should kill you if you did everything right. But one mistake, touching metal with bare skin, breathing too deeply, getting your clothing wet, could cause damage that never fully healed. Your body was changing. You could see it, feel it. Your hands were rougher, more calloused. Your face was weathered, aged. Your feet had permanent damage from repeated minor frostbite. You were thinner, harder, scarred. The cold was remaking you, cell by cell, into something that could survive here. But there was a cost. You knew you'd never be the same person who'd been arrested in Moscow. That person was gone, frozen away, replaced by this harder, colder version of yourself. If you ever made it back to warmth, back to civilization, you'd be bringing this cold place with you. It would live in your bones, your memories, your dreams. No one leaves for Koyansk unchanged, Ivan told you. Even if you walk away, you carry it with you forever. The cold becomes part of who you are. Nay, on Schwarz, back. You were learning this truth more deeply every day. The lessons of survival, the adaptations, the knowledge. All of it was changing you fundamentally. You were becoming a creature of the cold, shaped by it, scarred by it, but also strengthened by it in ways you didn't fully understand yet. And perhaps the most important lesson was this. You could survive more than you ever thought possible. The human spirit was remarkably difficult to break. Given even the smallest reasons to continue, duty to fellow prisoners, memories of home, simple stubbornness, you could endure conditions that seemed impossible. The knowledge accumulated, the lessons learned, the wisdom passed from veteran to newcomer, from survivor to struggler. This informal education was as important as any formal schooling you'd receive. This was the curriculum of survival at the edge of human habitability. And you were passing the course, day by day, lesson by lesson. Chapter 11. Those who don't survive. Not everyone survived. This was the inescapable truth of Verkhoyansk. No matter how much knowledge you accumulated, how careful you were, how strong your will to live, some people simply didn't make it. Death in the pole of cold came in many forms, sometimes quick, sometimes agonizingly slow. But it came for everyone eventually, and it came for some much sooner than others. During your first winter, In Verkhoyansk, 12 prisoners died. 12 out of about 200. That was considered a relatively good year. Some winters saw 20 or 30 deaths. Some years, during particularly bad cold snaps or disease outbreaks, even more. The deaths weren't dramatic, usually. No one fell over dead in the middle of work. There were no sudden, shocking moments. Instead, death arrived gradually, predictably, almost gently. You'd notice someone looking weaker, moving slower, coughing more, eating less. They'd still try to work, still try to participate in barracks life, but you could see them fading, like a candle burning down, growing dimmer until one morning the flame was simply gone. The first death you witnessed personally was a man named Sergei. He'd been coughing since before you arrived, a deep, wet cough that rattled in his chest. Tuberculosis, probably, though there was no official diagnosis. TB was common in the cramped, poorly ventilated barracks. Sergei grew thinner over weeks. His face became gaunt, his eyes sunken. He'd pause frequently while working, catching his breath, sometimes coughing up blood into a rag he kept in his pocket. Everyone knew he was dying. He knew it too, but there was nothing to be done. No medicine, no treatment, no hospital to send him to. One evening, Sergei simply didn't get up for the evening meal. He lay on his sleeping platform, breathing shallowly, eyes closed. Ivan checked on him, felt his forehead burning with fever. His body was fighting, losing. Through the night, you could hear his breathing, labored, irregular, stopping for long moments before resuming with a gasp. Prisoners near him on the sleeping platform tried to keep him comfortable, tried to keep him warm, knowing it was futile but unable to do nothing. Sometime in the early morning, his breathing stopped, completely. Finally, there was no dramatic death scene, no last words, just silence. Where there had been breathing, Sergei was gone. The guards were notified. His body was wrapped in the blanket he'd been sleeping under and carried out. It would be stored in a shed until the ground thawed enough to dig a grave. Probably not until May or June. Winter corpses accumulated, frozen solid, stacked like cordwood until spring. This matter-of-fact approach to death shocked you at first. Shouldn't there be more ceremony, more recognition of a life ended? But you came to understand the practicality. Everyone was struggling to survive. There wasn't energy or resources to spare for elaborate mourning. The dead were dead. The living had to continue living. We remember them when we can, Ivan said quietly after Sergei's death. But we can't let their deaths slow us down. That's what the cold wants. For us to stop, to give up, to join them. Other deaths followed different patterns. An older prisoner named Victor died from exposure. He'd gone out to use the latrine one night and, disoriented by fog and darkness, had wandered away from the settlement. They found his body 3 days later, frozen solid, perhaps 100 meters from the barracks. He'd been going in circles, unable to find his way back until exhaustion and cold took him. A young man named Andrei lost several toes to frostbite early in winter. The wounds became infected despite his attempts to keep them clean. The infection spread to his foot, then his leg. He developed a fever. His leg swelled, turned colors that no living flesh should be. Gangrenitor. Blood poisoning. He died over the course of 2 weeks, in considerable pain, while everyone watched helplessly. The barracks filled with the smell of rotting flesh from his infected leg. When death finally came, it was almost a mercy. Some deaths were quicker, but no less final. A prisoner named Boris fell while carrying logs, breaking his leg badly. The bone pierced through the skin, a compound fracture. With proper medical care, he might have survived. But here, in the cold, with no real medical facilities, the injury was essentially a death sentence. They set the leg as best they could, splinting it with boards. But infection set in within days. Boris developed a fever, became delirious, died within a week of the accident. The death that affected you most personally was Dimitri's, the young man you'd helped survive the journey from Yakutsk, whom you'd supported through his first months in Verkhoyansk, slowly deteriorated through your second winter. His frostbitten feet never properly healed. Chronic infections, persistent pain. He could barely walk by midwinter. He lost more toes. Then parts of his feet themselves began to rot. The circulation so compromised that tissue was dying. He developed a fever that wouldn't break. His body was fighting multiple infections simultaneously, weakened by malnutrition and chronic cold exposure. He grew delirious, talking to people who weren't there, reliving memories from his life before exile. You and Ivan took turns sitting with him during his final days. You'd hold his hand, carefully, because even that hurt him, and talk to him, trying to keep him oriented, keep him calm. Sometimes he recognized you. Often he didn't. One evening, as you sat beside him, he had a moment of lucidity. His eyes focused on your face. He managed a weak smile. "Thank you," he whispered, his voice barely audible, "for bringing me here, for helping me survive this long. And Louise, you wanted to say you were sorry, that you wished you could have done more, that it wasn't fair he was dying at 22 years old in this frozen hell. But you just squeezed his hand gently and nodded. He died that night, quietly, peacefully, with Ivan on one side and you on the other. He simply stopped breathing, his struggle finally over. The grief was heavy. You'd known him for over a year, had kept him alive through the journey, had shared countless conversations, meals, moments of warmth by the stove. Now he was gone. Another body wrapped in a blanket, carried out to the storage shed to await spring burial. You learned that grief in Verkhoyansk had to be compressed, abbreviated. You couldn't afford to mourn fully. The emotional energy required for proper grieving was energy you needed for survival. So you learned to grieve quickly. A few hours of sadness, of remembering, of acknowledging the loss. Then you had to let it go, push it down, and continue. "They're free now," Ivan said after Dimitri's death. "Free from the cold, from the suffering. We're the ones still trapped here." Ni, one, one, two. There was a kind of bitter comfort in this thought. Death, in a place like this, could be seen as escape, release, the end of struggling. Sometimes watching someone die, you'd feel a confusing mix of sadness and relief. Sad they were gone, but relieved their suffering had ended. Some prisoners actively chose death. They'd simply walk out into the fog or the darkness and not come back. Suicide disguised as getting lost, allowing their families to believe it was an accident rather than choice. It happened more often than was officially recorded. Others died from giving up without ever leaving the barracks. They'd stop eating, stop moving, stop engaging. Within weeks, their bodies would follow where their minds had gone. Death from despair was as real as death from exposure. The guards kept meticulous records of prisoner deaths. Names, dates, estimated causes. These records would eventually be sent to St. Petersburg, filed away in some administrative office, numbers in a ledger. That's what you become if you died here. A name in a ledger, a statistic, a number in the mortality rate. The graveyard, when you saw it in brief summer, was a sobering place. Hundreds of crude wooden markers, most without names, just numbers. The graves were shallow, Deep digging was impossible with the permafrost. Bodies weren't buried so much as placed in the ground and covered. The graveyard was also a reminder. You could end up there at any time. One mistake, one bit of bad luck, one moment of weakness. The margin between survival and death was razor thin here. But the deaths, as terrible as they were, also taught you something valuable. They taught you to appreciate being alive. Every morning you woke up and weren't dead was a victory. Every day you survived was a day you'd beaten the cold, beaten the odds, beaten the statistics. When you see enough death, you start to value life differently, Alexei observed. Not just surviving, but being alive, breathing, thinking, feeling. Even feeling cold is better than feeling nothing at all. This philosophy helped you endure. Yes, you were suffering. Yes, every day was hard, but you were alive. You could still see the northern lights, still taste tea, still feel warmth when you got close to the stove, still laugh occasionally at something absurd, still help others, still hope. The dead couldn't do any of that. They were beyond suffering, but also beyond everything else. You were still here, still experiencing existence, however harsh it might be. As your second winter in Verkhoyansk progressed, you'd lost count of how many prisoner deaths you'd witnessed. 15? 20? They blurred together after a while. Different faces, different names, but the same inevitable ending. Oh, the cold took them all eventually, one way or another. But you were still here, still breathing, still alive. And as long as you were alive, there was hope. Hope of surviving your sentence. Hope of eventual return to warmth. Hope of seeing Moscow again, seeing family again, experiencing normal life again. That hope was fragile, barely more than a whisper in the darkness. But it was enough. It had to be enough. Because the alternative, giving up, joining the others in the storage shed awaiting spring burial, was unacceptable. You'd survived too much, learned too much, endured too much to stop now. So you kept going. For Dmitri, for Sergei and Victor and all the others who hadn't made it. For yourself. For that distant, barely imaginable future when this would all be a memory, and you'd be warm again. The dead reminded you why living mattered, and you intended to keep living, no matter what the pole of cold threw at you. Chapter 12. The mind freezes too. The cold didn't just attack your body, it attacked your mind. This was something no one warned you about, something you only discovered through experience. The psychological effects of living in extreme cold and perpetual darkness, in constant survival mode, these were as damaging as any frostbite. The first sign was the dreams. Everyone had them. Strange, vivid dreams that felt more real than waking life. Dreams of warmth. Wait, dreams of summer days. Dreams of home. You'd dream you were sitting by a fire in your Moscow apartment, warm and comfortable, talking with friends. The dream would be so vivid you could feel the heat, smell the tea, hear the conversation. Then you'd wake up. The barracks would be dark and cold. The person next to you would be snoring or coughing. The reality would crash back, and the contrast between dream and reality was devastating. Some prisoners would wake from warm dreams and immediately start crying, unable to bear the transition back to this frozen existence. The dreams are the worst part, Pavel admitted one evening. When I'm awake, I know where I am. I've accepted it. But the dreams give me back everything I've lost. Then I wake up and lose it all over again. Every night. The darkness affected everyone's mental state. During the darkest months, late December through early February, the sun barely cleared the horizon. You'd have maybe 3 hours of weak, gray twilight at midday. The rest was darkness. 21 hours of darkness every day. Humans aren't designed for this. Your circadian rhythms depended on light and dark cycles. When those cycles become so distorted, your brain struggles. You'd feel tired when you should be awake, wide awake when you should sleep. Your sense of time would become fluid, unreliable. What day is it? Someone would ask. Thursday? Maybe Friday? No, I think it's Tuesday. No one knew. The days blurred together into an undifferentiated mass of cold and darkness. Only the guards' work schedules provided any structure, any way to mark time's passage. The isolation was another factor. You were surrounded by people, packed tightly into the barracks, but meaningful human connection became difficult. Everyone was focused on their own survival. Conversations were brief, practical. Deep friendships were rare. Getting too attached to someone meant suffering more when they died. You began to feel isolated even in crowds, alone inside your own head, surrounded by ghosts of people whose names you might not even know. This psychological isolation was crushing in ways that were hard to articulate. Depression was universal. Not sadness or grief, but true clinical depression. A flatness of affect, a lack of interest in anything, an overwhelming sense of futility. Why bother eating? Why bother working? Why bother surviving when this was all there was and all would ever be? You fought this depression daily. Some days you won. Some days it won. On bad days, you'd sit by the stove and stare at nothing for hours, unable to summon energy or interest in anything. Ivan would have to physically shake you, force you to eat, force you to engage. You can't let it take you, Ivan would insist. The moment you stop caring is the moment you start dying. But caring required energy you didn't have. Everything required energy. Thinking, feeling, hoping. And you were running on empty, burning through your reserves just to maintain body temperature and basic functions. Memory became unreliable. You'd forget things that happened yesterday, but remember childhood moments with perfect clarity. Your mind seemed to be prioritizing certain memories, warm memories, happy memories, while discarding recent experiences. Maybe this was a protective mechanism. Maybe it was damage. You'd also experience strange mental states that weren't quite hallucinations, but weren't quite reality. You'd see movement in your peripheral vision, shadows that weren't there. You'd hear voices in the wind. Your brain, starved for stimulation, would create its own. Some prisoners talked to themselves constantly, muttering conversations with people who weren't there, arguing with invisible opponents, narrating their own actions. This wasn't considered crazy. It was understood as a coping mechanism, a way to maintain some sense of social interaction, even when alone. You found yourself doing it too. Talking to Dmitri sometimes, even though he was dead. Having imaginary conversations with your sister in Moscow. Creating dialogue in your head just to hear language, to maintain that part of your brain. The concept of hope became complicated. Too much hope was dangerous, setting yourself up for devastating disappointment. Too little hope meant giving up. You had to find a middle ground, a kind of realistic pessimism that acknowledged how bad things were while maintaining the bare minimum belief that survival was possible. Don't hope for rescue, Alexei advised. Don't hope for early release. Don't hope for things to get better. Just hope to survive today. That's manageable hope. Anything more will destroy you. Anger became a survival tool. When you felt yourself slipping into apathy, into dangerous indifference, anger could pull you back. Anger at the Tsar. Anger at the system that sent you here. Anger at the cold itself. Anger was energy. emotion, engagement with reality. Better to be angry than to feel nothing. You'd see prisoners punch walls, scream into the wind, rage against their circumstances. The guards would watch without intervening. They understood. Anger was better than the alternative. But constant anger was exhausting too. You couldn't maintain it indefinitely. It would burn out, leaving you emptier than before. So you'd cycle through emotional states: anger, depression, acceptance, hope, despair, never settling into any one state for long. The cold also created a strange time distortion. Days felt long. The work, the suffering, the constant discomfort stretched time, but weeks and months seemed to disappear. You'd realize suddenly that you'd been in for Koyansk for 6 months, 8 months, a year, and you could barely account for where that time had gone. Time moves differently here, Ivan explained. The days crawl. The years fly. Before you know it, you've lost years of your life to this place. And you can't remember most of it. Your mind protects you by forgetting. You understood this. Large portions of your time here were already becoming hazy, indistinct. Individual days were lost. What remained were emotional impressions: cold, hunger, exhaustion, rather than specific memories. Some prisoners withdrew completely into their own minds. They'd sit in the corner of the barracks, eyes open but seeing nothing, completely internal. They were physically present, but psychologically absent. These men were usually dead within weeks. The body couldn't survive once the mind had checked out. You fought against this withdrawal by forcing yourself to engage with external reality. You'd focus on specific things: the pattern of ice on the windows, the sound of wood burning in the stove, the feeling of hot tea going down your throat. Small anchors to keep you connected to the physical world, rather than drifting off into your own head. Religion provided structure for some prisoners. The rituals of prayer, the church services on Sundays, the religious calendar marking time. These helped maintain mental coherence. You weren't particularly religious before exile, but you found yourself praying sometimes. Not necessarily to God, but to something. To the universe, to fate, to whatever force might be listening. The prayers weren't elaborate, just simple requests. Let me survive today. Let me stay warm enough. Let me not go crazy. Small prayers for small mercies. Other prisoners developed elaborate mental routines to stay sane. Alexei would recite poetry he'd memorized, hours of verses flowing from his memory. Another man would practice mental arithmetic, solving complex math problems in his head. A third would replay chess games he'd seen years ago, move by move, visualizing the board. These mental exercises kept the brain active, fighting against the numbing effect of monotony and depression. You developed your own routine, trying to remember every street in your Moscow neighborhood, every person you'd known, every book you'd read. When you couldn't remember something, you'd work on it for days until the memory returned. This wasn't just nostalgia. It was mental survival, keeping your mind active, engaged, remembering that you were more than just a body trying to stay warm. You were a person with a history, with knowledge, with an identity beyond prisoner and for Koyansk. But sometimes, late at night, lying on the sleeping platform, unable to sleep despite exhaustion, you'd wonder if you were still the same person who'd been arrested in Moscow. The physical changes were obvious, but the psychological changes might be deeper, more fundamental. What if you survived your sentence but returned to Moscow as someone entirely different? What if the cold had frozen parts of your personality, your emotions, your ability to connect with others? What if you could never be warm again? Not really. Not in your mind. These thoughts were dangerous. You'd force them away, focus on immediate survival rather than distant possibilities. But they'd return, persistent, troubling. unanswerable. The mind freezes too, not in the literal sense. Your brain didn't freeze solid like your eyelashes or your breath, but in other ways, just as real. Parts of your psyche going numb, emotions dulling, hope crystallizing and becoming brittle, your sense of self becoming harder, colder, more rigid. You were adapting to survive, but adaptation always came at a cost. The question was whether the cost was worth paying, whether surviving for Koyansk meant destroying the person you've been and becoming someone new, someone harder, colder, more damaged. You didn't have an answer. You just kept going day by day, trying to maintain enough of yourself to make survival meaningful. Because surviving without sanity, without self, without mind, that wasn't really surviving at all. That was just existence. And you wanted more than that. You wanted to live, truly live. Wanted not just have a pulse and a body temperature above freezing. So you fought the psychological cold just as hard as you fought the physical cold. And some days, you even won. Chapter 13. The walrus people there were some prisoners who didn't just survive Verkhoyansk, they seemed to thrive in it. Or perhaps thrive was the wrong word. They transformed so completely that the cold no longer affected them the way it affected everyone else. The other prisoners called them the walrus people, after the Arctic animals that lived comfortably in freezing water. Alexei was one of them. 3 years in Verkhoyansk had changed him fundamentally. He'd talk about the cold the way other people talked about weather, casually, without fear or concern. He'd work outside in -50 with minimal complaint. He claimed he barely felt it anymore. Your body adapts, he explained one evening. The blood vessels in your extremities learn to constrict less, maintaining better circulation. Your metabolism adjusts, generating more heat. Your nervous system recalibrates what it considers dangerous cold. It's not that I don't feel it. I do. But it feels normal now. Comfortable, almost. You didn't know if this was true adaptation or just nerve damage. Maybe his fingers and toes were so scarred by repeated frostbite that they couldn't feel cold properly anymore. Maybe his sense of temperature had been broken by prolonged exposure. But regardless of the mechanism, the effect was real. Alexei functioned in conditions that would incapacitate newcomers. Even was another. 5 years in Verkhoyansk, longer than almost anyone except the Yakut natives and a few long-term guards. He moved through the cold with a kind of ease that seemed impossible. He'd work outside for hours without the frantic urgency that most prisoners felt. He'd pause, rest, work at a steady pace rather than rushing to get back inside. The secret, Ivan told you during your second winter, is accepting it. Stop fighting the cold. Stop resisting it. Let it be what it is, and find your way to coexist with it. Fighting it just exhausts you. Acceptance conserves energy. This sounded like mystical nonsense at first, but you began to understand what he meant. So much energy went into psychological resistance. The constant mental commentary about how cold it was, how much you hated it, how unbearable it all was. That mental resistance didn't make you warmer. It just made you miserable. When you stopped fighting, when you simply accepted this as cold, I am cold. This is the reality. Something shifted. The suffering didn't disappear, but it became more bearable. You found a kind of cold acceptance, literally and figuratively. Some prisoners took it further. There was a man named Konstantin who'd been in Verkhoyansk for 6 years. He barely wore more clothing than the guards. He'd walk outside without wrapping his face. He'd sometimes go out at night just to stand in the cold, as if testing himself, proving he could handle it. I'm more adapted to this than to warmth now. Constantine said once. When I go inside, when it gets above -20, I start sweating. I feel uncomfortable. The cold is where I belong now. This was disturbing to hear. The idea that someone could become so adapted to extreme cold that normal temperatures felt wrong. It suggested a transformation so complete that return to normal life might be impossible. You noticed changes in yourself too. Things that had been agonizing in your first months now felt manageable. -30, which had seemed unbearable at first, now felt almost mild. You could work outside at -45 without the panic you'd initially felt. Your body had learned tricks, how to conserve heat, how to keep blood flowing to extremities, how to generate warmth through subtle muscle movements. But were these healthy adaptations or signs of damage? Were you becoming stronger or just more broken in ways that happened to be useful here? The line between adaptation and injury wasn't clear. Frostbite damage that destroyed nerve endings meant less pain from cold. Was that adaptation or disability? A metabolism that burned calories faster to generate heat meant better temperature regulation, but also required more food you didn't have, leading to dangerous weight loss. Your hands had changed. The skin was thick, calloused, cracked in places that never fully healed. You could touch things that would have caused sharp pain when you first arrived and barely feel it. Useful adaptation? Or nerve damage? Your body had also learned to shiver differently. In your first winter, shivering had been violent, uncontrollable, exhausting. Now, your body shivered in a more controlled way. Constant, subtle tremors that generated heat without burning through energy as quickly. An adaptation, certainly, but it meant you were shivering almost constantly, even when you weren't consciously aware of it. The psychological adaptations were even more ambiguous. You could now look at a body being carried out to the storage shed and feel only mild sadness rather than shock or horror. Was this healthy emotional regulation or dangerous desensitization? You could sleep through almost anything now. Cold, noise, discomfort that would have kept you awake for hours in your first months. Good for survival, but also a sign that your nervous system had been pushed beyond normal functioning. The Yakut natives represented the ultimate adaptation. They'd lived in this climate for generations, and their bodies had evolved accordingly. They were generally shorter, more compact, less surface area relative to volume, better for heat retention. Their metabolism ran hotter. Their children grew up in the cold and never knew anything else. You watched the Yakut moving through their daily lives with a kind of awe. They travel long distances in extreme cold, set up temporary camps, hunt, fish, tend to their reindeer herds. What was survival mode for you was just normal life for them. But even they had limits. You'd seen Yakut natives with frostbite damage, with missing fingers or toes. Even they could be killed by the cold if they made mistakes. They were adapted but not invulnerable. One of the guards, a Yakut man named Oyun, sometimes talked with the prisoners. He was curious about how outsiders experienced a cold that was normal to him. "You'll never be like us," he said matter-of-factly, not cruelly. "Your bodies weren't built for this. You can adapt some, but you'll always be struggling. We were born here. The cold is in our blood, in our bones. For us, this is home. For you, it will always be exile." He was right. No matter how much you adapted, this would never feel like home. It would always be the place you were sent to suffer, the place trying to kill you. Any adaptation was just learning to die more slowly. But some prisoners seemed to forget this. They'd become so absorbed in survival that they lost track of why they were surviving. They'd forgotten there was a world beyond Verkhoyansk, that they weren't meant to be here forever. "Don't become too comfortable," Ivan warned, even though he was one of the most adapted prisoners. "Don't let this place become normal. Stay angry. Stay homesick. Stay aware that this is wrong, that you don't belong here. The moment you accept Verkhoyansk as home, you've lost something essential. This was the paradox of adaptation. You had to adapt enough to survive, but not so much that you forgot what you were surviving for. You had to become harder, colder, more resilient, but retain enough humanity to remain yourself. The Walrus people had solved the survival problem, but might have lost themselves in the process. They'd become creatures perfectly suited to the pole of coal, but perhaps no longer suited to anywhere else. When their sentences ended, would they be able to readjust to normal life? Or had they been too permanently changed? You didn't know. You were somewhere in the middle, not a newcomer anymore, not yet transformed into a walrus person. You'd adapted, but remained aware of the cost of adaptation. You become harder, but tried to retain some softness. You'd learn to survive, but tried not to forget what you were surviving for. Every night, before sleeping, you'd make yourself remember something from before. A meal you enjoyed, a conversation with a friend, the view from your window in Moscow, sunlight on water, the smell of spring, anything to remind yourself that there was more to life than cold and survival. This was your anchor, your tether to a world beyond Verkhoyansk. Your protection against becoming a walrus person who'd forgotten how to be human. The adaptation was necessary. The transformation was inevitable. But you'd fight to ensure it didn't go so far that you became something that could never return home. Even if home was years away, even if it might be forever, you'd keep that memory alive, that hope alive, that connection to warmth and normalcy alive. Because without it, you might survive Verkhoyansk but lose everything that made survival worthwhile. Chapter 14, When Spring Never Comes, 20 minutes, up to 2,200 words. Time in Verkhoyansk played cruel tricks. Your first winter felt eternal, each day dragging on with impossible slowness. But when you look back, entire months had vanished, compressed into hazy impressions of cold and darkness. Your second winter arrived with shocking speed. Summer had been brief, just 2 months of almost warmth, when temperatures climbed above freezing and the world turned muddy and green. Then autumn came quickly, frost returning in September, snow by October. By November, you were back in deep cold, and it felt like the brief summer had been a dream. Summer is a lie, Alexei said as temperatures dropped back below -40. A brief hallucination the climate grants us before winter returns. Don't get attached to it. Winter is the truth here. Winter is what's real. This second winter was different from your first. You knew what to expect now. The extreme cold wasn't shocking anymore. It was familiar. The darkness wasn't disorienting. It was routine. The suffering wasn't surprising. It was normal. This familiarity was dangerous in its own way. The shock and fear of your first winter had kept you alert, careful, attentive to danger. Now in your second winter, there was a risk of complacency. You knew the cold could kill you, but you'd survived it once. So maybe you'd gotten careless. Pavel lost 2 fingers to frostbite in your second winter, precisely because of this complacency. He'd been working outside, confident in his ability to handle the cold, and hadn't noticed his fingers going numb until it was too late. By the time he warmed them by the stove, the damage was done. The fingers turned black over the following days and eventually fell off. I thought I knew what I was doing, Pavel said bitterly, staring at his damaged hand. I survived last winter fine. I got confident. Stupid. The cold doesn't care how much experience you have. One moment of carelessness, and it takes pieces of you. You took this lesson to heart. Never assume you're safe. Never assume you've mastered this environment. The cold was patient, always waiting for a mistake. Your third winter came faster than the second. Time was accelerating, months blurring together. You'd been in Verkhoyansk for over 2 years now. Your 5-year sentence was nearly half complete. But half complete felt both like an achievement and an impossibility. You'd survived this long, but you had just as long to go. The psychological weight of this realization was crushing. 2 more years. 2 more cycles of brutal winter and brief summer. 2 more years of inadequate food, grinding labor, constant cold. 2 more years of watching people die, of struggling to maintain your sanity, of fighting to survive. Don't think about it, Ivan counseled. Don't count. Don't calculate. It doesn't help. Just exist, day by day. The years will pass whether you count them or not. But you couldn't help counting, couldn't help calculating. Your mind would do the math automatically. Roughly 730 days remaining. If you lost 2 prisoners per month on average, that meant you'd witness about 30 more deaths before release. If you continued losing weight at the current rate, would your body hold up for 2 more years? These calculations were futile and depressing, but your mind couldn't stop making them. Some prisoners in their final year sentences became different people. They were more cautious, paranoid about dying so close to freedom. They'd take fewer risks, volunteer for less dangerous work, obsess over every small health problem. The irony was that this anxiety probably made them more likely to die. Stress and fear burned energy and weakened the immune system. Others became reckless in their final year, as if tempting fate. They'd take unnecessary risks, work harder than necessary, push themselves beyond safe limits. Maybe they were testing themselves, proving they'd truly conquered this place. Maybe they were unconsciously self-destructing, unable to cope with the approaching possibility of freedom. Ivan was in his final year during your 3rd winter. 5 years in Verkhoyansk, and his sentence would be complete in spring. You'd asked him how he felt about it, expecting excitement or relief. Terrified, he admitted. I've been here so long, I don't know if I can function anywhere else. This place is horrible, but it's what I know. What if I can't adapt back to normal life? What if I'm too damaged to return to society? This fear made sense. Ivan had arrived as a middle-aged clerk from St. Petersburg. He'd leave as a scarred, weathered man in his late 50s who'd spent 5 years in the coldest place on earth. How would he reconnect with his family? His former colleagues? How would he explain what this place had done to him? Also, Ivan continued quietly, part of me doesn't want to leave. Not because I like it here. I hate every frozen moment of it. But leaving means the people still here, people like you, will go on suffering without me. It feels like abandonment. You understood this feeling. The bonds formed here were strong, forged in shared suffering. When someone left, it felt like a small death. Someone you'd survived with was gone, and you were still here, still trapped. But Ivan did leave. Spring came. His sentence was complete, and he was released. The morning he departed, prisoners gathered to say goodbye. There were no dramatic speeches, just quiet handshakes, nods, unspoken wishes for safety and survival. You watched him walk away from the settlement, heading toward Yakutsk and eventually toward European Russia. He looked back once, his expression unreadable. Then he was gone. The barracks felt emptier without him. Ivan had been a constant presence, a source of wisdom and stability. His absence was palpable, but the barracks didn't mourn long. There was a new arrival that same week, a young man sent from Irkutsk, terrified and unprepared. The cycle continued. Your 4th winter arrived, and you'd been in Verkhoyansk for 3.5 years, longer than most prisoners survived. You were a veteran now. one of the experienced ones that newcomers looked to for guidance. The role Ivan had played, you now played for others. This responsibility was both burden and purpose. Helping others survive gave your own survival meaning, beyond mere self-preservation. Teaching someone how to wrap their feet properly, how to recognize frostbite, how to pace their work. These small acts connected you to something larger than yourself, but it also meant watching people you'd helped eventually die. A young man named Yuri, whom you taught to survive his first winter, died in his second winter from pneumonia. You'd kept him alive long enough to experience more suffering before death claimed him anyway. Was that mercy or cruelty? Time continued its strange flow. Days crawled. Months disappeared. Your fifth winter, your final winter, if you survived it, felt both immediate and impossibly distant. You've been counting, despite trying not to. Roughly 180 days until your sentence was complete. Then 150. Then 100. As the numbers decreased, anxiety increased. You were so close. After all this suffering, all this endurance, could you possibly die now, so near to freedom? This anxiety made you more careful. You checked your extremities constantly. You avoided any unnecessary risks. You ate every bit of your rations, even when you weren't hungry. You did everything possible to maximize your survival chances through these final months. Spring came slowly, as it always did. The temperatures climbed gradually from -60 to -50 to -40. Daylight returned, first just a few hours, then more. By April, it was barely freezing at night. By May, the snow was melting, revealing the ground underneath for the first time in 7 months. And then, one morning in June, you were called to the commandant's office. Your sentence was complete. You were free to go. Free. The word felt strange, meaningless almost. You'd been here so long that freedom seemed like an abstraction, something that happened to other people but not to you. But it was real. Your papers were processed. Your release was official. You could leave Verkhoyansk. The walk out of the settlement, heading toward Yakutsk and a long journey west, was surreal. You kept expecting someone to call you back, to tell you there'd been a mistake, that you weren't actually free, but no one called. You just kept walking, away from the barracks, away from the pole of coal, toward something else. What that something else was, you didn't know. 5 years in Verkhoyansk had changed you fundamentally. The person who'd been arrested in Moscow no longer existed. Someone harder, colder, more damaged had taken his place. But you were alive. Against all odds, despite everything this place had thrown at you, you'd survived. As you walked, you didn't look back. There was nothing behind you but suffering and loss. Ahead lay uncertainty, but also possibility. The cold would stay with you forever. In your scars, your memories, your dreams. You'd carry Verkhoyansk in your bones for the rest of your life. But you were leaving. Finally, impossibly leaving. And though you didn't know what came next, at least it wouldn't be -60 degrees. At least there would be warmth. Chapter 15. The warmth of others. 25 minutes, 82,600 words. In the midst of all the suffering, all the death, all the cold that tried to freeze everything, including hope itself, there was warmth. Not physical warmth, though that was precious, but human warmth, kindness, connection, daimto, the small acts of humanity that somehow survived in the most inhuman place on Earth. These moments of warmth were what made survival bearable. More than that, they were what made survival meaningful. You remember the first time another prisoner shared his food with you. It was early in your first winter, and you were struggling. You'd worked particularly hard that day, and returned to the barracks exhausted, barely able to move. Your ration of bread seemed impossibly small, inadequate to restore your energy. An older prisoner named Mikhail, whom you barely knew, broke off a piece of his own bread and handed it to you without a word. Just a small piece, maybe 50 grams. But in Verkhoyansk, where food was survival, this was an extraordinary gift. Thank you, you'd managed to say. He'd shrugged. Someone did the same for me once. You'll do it for someone else later. This casual generosity, in a place where everyone was starving, was profound. It established a principle. Despite the brutal conditions designed to make everyone compete for scarce resources, humanity could persist. People could still help each other. You'd remembered Mikhail's words. And later, when you saw a newcomer struggling, you'd share your bread with him, passing on the kindness, creating a chain of small mercies that extended backward and forward in time, connecting prisoners who'd never meet each other, but who were united by these acts of sharing. The barracks at night, despite the cold and crowding, sometimes felt almost like a home. Prisoners would gather around the stove and talk, not always about the cold or survival or the work. Sometimes just, hey, talk. Stories from their previous lives, jokes, philosophical discussions, debates about literature or politics, or absurd hypothetical scenarios. These conversations were lifelines to normalcy. They reminded everyone that they were more than just bodies trying to stay warm. They were people with thoughts, opinions, humor, intelligence. The cold could freeze your body, but these conversations kept your mind and spirit alive. Pyotr, the former musician, would sometimes hum melodies in the evening, without instruments, without sheet music, just from memory. Other prisoners would listen in silence, transported briefly to concert halls and theaters, to a world where beauty existed. One evening, Pyotr hummed a melody you recognized, a folk song your mother used to sing. The recognition hit you with unexpected force. Suddenly, you weren't in Verkhoyansk. You were 7 years old, sitting in your mother's kitchen, listening to her sing while she cooked. The memory was so vivid, it hurt. When Pyotr, you thanked him, your voice thick with emotion. Music is one of the few things the cold can't freeze, Pyotr said simply. It lives in memory, in breath, in the spaces between heartbeats. They can exile us to the coldest place on earth, but they can't take away the songs. The relationships between prisoners were complex. You weren't exactly friends. Friendship required a kind of emotional safety and leisure that didn't exist here. But you were something deeper than friends. Comrades, maybe. Survivors linked by shared experience too profound for normal friendship. You trust these men with your life, because you did constantly, daily. When you worked together, you watched out for each other's frostbite. When you slept packed together, you trusted them not to steal what little you had. When someone was struggling, you helped them, knowing that soon you'd be the one struggling and needing help. There was a purity to these relationships. No pretense. No social games. Just stark, essential human connection, forged in necessity. Dmitri had become like a younger brother to you. You'd helped him survive the journey, helped him through his first winter, tried to keep him alive through his final illness. His death had left a void. But in the time you'd had together, there'd been real connection, real care. You'd talk with Dmitri about his life before exile, his family, his sister whom he missed desperately, his modest dreams of becoming a teacher. He'd listen to your stories too, about Moscow, about your work, about the simple pleasures you'd taken for granted. When I get out, Dmitri had said once, first thing I'll do is sit in a warm bath for an hour. Then I'll eat a huge meal. Then I'll sleep in a real bed for a whole day. Then maybe I'll start thinking about the rest of my life. simple dreams. Warm bath, hot food, comfortable bed. The basics of human comfort had become the height of aspiration in Verkhoyansk, God. And there was something beautiful in that simplicity. The cold had stripped away all the complications and revealed what actually mattered. Warmth, food, rest, connection. Dmitri never got his warm bath, but in the time you'd spent together, there'd been real friendship. Brief, tragic, but real. And that mattered more than the tragic ending. Alexei, the veteran survivor, became a mentor. He'd saved your life multiple times with his knowledge, teaching you survival techniques, warning you about dangers, helping you through moments when you wanted to give up. But beyond the practical help, Alexei provided something else. Proof that long-term survival was possible. In your darkest moments, when 5 years seemed impossibly long, you'd look at Alexei and think, he survived 3 years. If he can do it, maybe I can too. Why do you help the newcomers? You'd asked Alexei once. You could focus on your own survival, not waste energy on others. Because that's how we stay human, Alexei had replied. The moment we stop caring about others, stop helping, stop connecting, that's when the cold wins. It doesn't just freeze our bodies then. It freezes our hearts. I'd rather die human than survive as something else. This philosophy kept many prisoners alive, not just physically, but spiritually. The acts of kindness and connection weren't luxuries or distractions from survival. They were survival itself, surviving as a human being rather than as an animal. Even the guards occasionally showed unexpected humanity. Most were indifferent or actively cruel, but some showed small mercies. A guard who looked the other way when prisoners shared food. Another who accidentally left extra firewood near the barracks. A third who'd warned prisoners when a superior was in a particularly harsh mood. These small acts required no effort for the guards, but made enormous differences to prisoners. They reminded everyone that even in a system designed to be cruel, individual human choices still mattered. There was a guard named Pyotr, different from the prisoner Pyotr, who'd sometimes talk with prisoners during work breaks. He was a local Yakut, and he'd tell stories about the region, about his people's history, about living in harmony with the cold rather than fighting it. My grandfather lived to be 92, Guard Pyotr said once. He spent every winter of his life in temperatures that would kill most people. But he understood the cold, respected it. Is it ye? Oh, adapted to it. The cold isn't evil. It just is. Like water or wind, it's humans who assign meaning to it. This perspective was helpful in a strange way. The cold wasn't punishing you. It wasn't cruel. It was just cold, following the laws of physics and climate. Depersonalizing it somehow made it more bearable. The moments of warmth came in unexpected forms. Someone finding a tiny piece of metal and fashioning it into a crude needle so that prisoners could repair their clothing more effectively. Another prisoner teaching others to read in the evenings, expanding their minds even as their bodies froze. A third organizing a makeshift celebration on Christmas, with no gifts or special food, but with songs and shared stories and the simple acknowledgement that this day mattered. You remember one evening in particular, deep in your third winter. The barracks was colder than usual. Something wrong with the stove that no one had been able to fix. Everyone was huddled on the sleeping platforms, trying to generate warmth. Someone started telling a story, a fairy tale maybe, about a magical land that was always warm, where fruit grew on trees year-round and no one ever felt cold. It was childish, absurd, completely unrealistic, but everyone listened, transfixed. Others added to the story. It became a collaborative fantasy, each person contributing details about this imaginary warm paradise. The golden beaches, the tropical flowers, the soft rain that was warm instead of freezing, the endless sunshine. For perhaps an hour, that drafty, freezing barracks was filled with warmth, not physical warmth, but the warmth of shared imagination, shared longing, shared humanity. Everyone knew the story wasn't real, but that didn't matter. The telling of it, the collective creation of something beautiful, that was real. That was human connection, surviving in the most inhuman place. When the story ended, the barracks was still cold. The stove still wasn't working properly. Nothing had physically changed. But somehow, everyone felt warmer. The shared experience had done something that physical heat couldn't. It had reminded everyone that they were human beings capable of creating beauty, even here. These were the moments that made survival worthwhile. Not just surviving, existing in misery until your sentence ended, but surviving with humanity intact, with the ability to still care, still connect, still create meaning even in meaninglessness. The warmth of others was what kept the cold from freezing your heart. And as you walked away from Verkhoyansk after your 5-year sentence, what you carried with you wasn't just trauma and scars. You carried these moments too. The bread shared, the songs hummed, the stories told, the hands that helped you when you fell, the words of encouragement when you wanted to give up. You carried the names and faces of people who'd helped you survive. Mikhail, Dot, Dmitri, Dot, Ivan, Dot, Alexei, Pyotr, the musician, Guard, Pyotr, Pavel, Diet, Konstantin, Show, dozens of others whose names you'd forgotten, but whose kindnesses you remembered. They'd given you pieces of themselves, their warmth, their knowledge, their hope, and those pieces had kept you alive. Some of them hadn't survived themselves, but their warmth lived on in you, would live on in you for the rest of your life. This was the paradox of Verkhoyansk. It was the coldest place on Earth, designed to break human beings through extremes of temperature and suffering. But it was also where you'd experience some of the purest human warmth. Kindness stripped of pretense, connection forged in necessity, love expressed through the simple act of helping someone survive another day. The cold had tried to freeze everything, but it had failed. In the hearts of prisoners sharing bread, teaching survival, telling stories, helping each other through one more impossible day, warmth had survived. And that warmth, more than anything else, was what made you human. Chapter 16. The ones who returned the journey from Verkhoyansk back to civilization took 3 months. 3 months that felt both impossibly long and strangely short. After 5 years in the pole of cold, even the relative mildness of summer Siberia felt like luxury. You traveled with a small group of released prisoners, all heading west, all carrying their scars, visible and invisible, from their time in Verkhoyansk. The conversations during this journey were strange, disconnected. No one knew how to talk about where you'd been or what you'd experienced. The enormity of it resisted language. Some of the released prisoners seemed euphoric, ecstatic to be free, already making plans for their return to normal life. Others were quiet, almost depressed, struggling with the reality of freedom after years of rigid routine and survival mode. You fell somewhere in between, grateful to be alive and free, but deeply uncertain about what came next. You'd survived Verkhoyansk, but had Verkhoyansk also survived in you? Had it become part of you permanently? The gradual return to warmth was physically disorienting. As you traveled west and south, temperatures climbed. By the time you reached Irkutsk, summer temperatures were above 20 degrees Celsius. This felt impossibly hot. You found yourself sweating, uncomfortable in warmth that would have seemed moderate before your exile. Your body's temperature regulation had been recalibrated by 5 years of extreme cold. What should feel comfortable felt oppressive. You'd sleep with windows open, seeking cold air, unable to tolerate the stuffy warmth of indoor spaces. Will we ever feel normal again? Another released prisoner asked one evening in Irkutsk as you waited for transport further west. No one had an answer. The train journey from Irkutsk to Moscow took another 2 weeks. Real trains this time, not prison transports. You could sit by the window, watch the landscape change, see forests and fields and villages passing by. After years of seeing nothing but snow and permafrost, the variety was almost overwhelming. You noticed things you'd never paid attention to before your exile. Colors, dot. The world had so many colors, greens and browns and blues and golds. In Verkhoyansk, everything had been white or gray or black. Your eyes had forgotten what a fully colored world looked like. Birds flying, just ordinary birds. Sparrows, crows, hawks. But watching them move through warm air, hearing their calls, seeing them build nests in trees, it felt miraculous. Life, thriving, abundant, effortless. Not struggling just to survive, but flourishing. People at train stations going about their normal lives, buying food, talking, laughing, children playing, couples holding hands. Ordinary human existence that seemed extraordinary to you now. These people had no idea how fortunate they were. They were warm. They were safe. They were free. They took it all for granted. You wanted to shake them, tell them, appreciate this. Appreciate the warmth, the food, the freedom, the normalcy. Appreciate that you're not fighting for survival every moment. But you said nothing. How could you explain? They'd never understand unless they'd experienced what you'd experienced. Moscow appeared on the horizon. Familiar skyline, church domes, the city you'd been arrested in 5 years and 8 months ago. Your sentence had been 5 years, but with the journey to and from Verkhoyansk, you'd been gone longer. The city looked the same, but you weren't the same. You stepped off the train as a stranger in your own homeland. Your family had been notified of your release. They were waiting at the station. Your mother, your sister, an uncle. The reunion was emotional, but also awkward, strained. They looked at you with a mixture of joy and horror. Joy that you were alive and home. Horror at what you'd become. You'd lost perhaps 20 kilograms. Your face was weathered, aged far beyond 5 years. Your hands were scarred, missing parts of 2 fingers to frostbite. You walked with a slight limp, damage to your feet that had never fully healed. You looked like a man in his 50s, though you were barely 35. We thought we'd lost you, your mother said, crying, holding you carefully as if you might break. We heard so many people don't come back from Siberia. Most don't, you confirmed quietly. Your sister had prepared a room for you in her apartment. It was warm, heated with a proper stove. There was a real bed with clean sheets. There was food, real food, abundant food, more than you could eat in a day. That first night back in Moscow, lying in a comfortable bed in a warm room, surrounded by your family, you should have felt relief, joy, God, peace, and instead, you felt profoundly disoriented. The bed was too soft. The room was too warm. The silence was wrong. You were used to falling asleep to the sounds of other prisoners, breathing, coughing, shifting. Here, alone in a room, the quiet was eerie. You got up and opened the window wide, letting in cold autumn air. That felt better. You took the blankets off the bed and lay down with just a sheet. That felt more normal. But sleep still didn't come easily. Over the following weeks, you tried to readjust to normal life. It was harder than you'd imagined. Simple things were difficult. Shopping at markets was overwhelming. So many choices, so much abundance. You'd stand in front of a bread stall, paralyzed by the variety. After 5 years of eating the same black bread daily, having options was too much. Social interactions were exhausting. People wanted to hear about your experience, but they didn't really want to hear about it. They wanted a cleaned up version, an adventure story with a happy ending. They couldn't handle the truth. The death, the suffering, the moral compromises, the way the cold had stripped everything down to bare survival. So you learned to give them what they wanted. It was very cold, very difficult, but I survived. Brief, vague, nothing that would disturb their comfortable assumptions about the world. But with other released exiles, you could talk. There was an informal network of returned Siberian prisoners in Moscow. You'd meet in tea houses or parks, and conversation would flow easily because you shared a common language, common experiences. These were the only people who truly understood. "Do you still feel cold all the time?" one former exile asked. "Even in warm rooms?" "Yes," you confirmed. "Always cold now, like it's inside me." "Me too, 5 years back, and I'm still cold. I don't think it ever goes away." The nightmares came almost every night. You'd dream you were back in Verkhoyansk, working in the forest, and suddenly the fog would descend. You'd be lost, unable to find your way back, knowing you were going to freeze to death. You'd wake up gasping, disoriented, sometimes not sure where you were. Or you'd dream that your release had been a mistake, that guards were coming to take you back. You'd wake in panic, heart racing, needing several minutes to remember that you were free, that your sentence was complete, that they couldn't send you back. Your mother noticed you checking your fingers and toes every morning, a habit from Verkhoyansk that you couldn't break. Checking for frostbite that couldn't possibly occur in a heated Moscow apartment. But the habit was so deeply ingrained that you did it automatically, without thinking. Work was another challenge. You'd been a clerk before your arrest, working with documents and accounts. You tried to return to similar work, but found you couldn't concentrate. The indoor work felt stifling. Sitting at a desk all day felt impossible after years of physical labor. The trivial concerns of office work, filing systems, bureaucratic procedures, seemed meaningless compared to the life and death struggles you'd face. You seemed distracted, your supervisor commented after you'd made several errors in your work. "Is everything all right?" How could you explain that you couldn't focus on accounting because part of your mind was still in Verkhoyansk, still monitoring for frostbite, still calculating survival? That these papers and numbers felt absurdly unimportant when people were dying in the pole of cold at this very moment? You couldn't explain. So, you just apologized and tried harder to focus. But the disconnect remained. You found yourself drawn to cold. On winter days, you'd go for long walks, seeking out the coldest places. Other Muscovites would be bundled up, hurrying from building to building. You'd walk slowly, almost meditatively in the cold. It felt familiar, comfortable, in a way that warmth didn't anymore. "You're going to get sick," your sister scolded. "It's -10 out there, and you're barely dressed." But -10 felt like nothing. -10 was warm. Your body's calibration had been permanently altered. What was cold to others was moderate to you. What was comfortable to others was stifling. Relationships were complicated. Your family tried to understand, but they couldn't really. They'd lived their normal lives while you'd been frozen in time, or frozen in Verkhoyansk. You'd been through experiences that had fundamentally changed you, while they'd remained largely the same. The gap between your experiences was too wide to bridge easily. Friends from before your arrest were strangers now. Some had moved away, married, started families. Others had simply moved on with their lives. When you reconnected, conversations were stilted, awkward. You had nothing in common anymore. Their concerns, social gossip, minor inconveniences, petty grievances, seemed incomprehensibly trivial to you. I'm sorry I complained about the weather. One former friend said after you'd barely responded to his story about a rainy day ruining his plans. I suppose you've experienced much worse. You just nodded. Much worse didn't begin to cover it. Intimacy was difficult. You've been alone, emotionally alone, for so long that letting people close felt dangerous. You built walls for survival. Learned not to get too attached, because attachment meant suffering when people died. Those walls didn't come down easily. A woman at church showed interest in you. She was kind, patient, clearly attracted to you despite your scars and damaged appearance. But when she touched your hand, you flinched, not because of her, but because physical touch had become associated with survival. Helping someone up, checking someone for frostbite, huddling for warmth. Touch for its own sake, touch as affection, felt foreign. I'm sorry, she said, withdrawing her hand. Did I hurt you? No, you said. I'm not ready. She was understanding, but you could see the confusion in her eyes. She couldn't comprehend what not ready meant for someone who'd returned from Verkhoyansk. The physical scars were obvious. The missing fingers, the damaged feet, the weathered skin. But the psychological scars were deeper and harder to explain. You've been changed at a fundamental level. Your priorities have been reordered. Your understanding of what mattered had been stripped down and rebuilt. Warmth, food, shelter, human connection. These were what mattered. Everything else was secondary, optional, ultimately unimportant. But modern life insisted that all the secondary things were what mattered most. Career advancement, social status, material possessions, trivial social obligations. You couldn't make yourself care about these things. And that made you an outsider in your own society. There were moments of reconnection, though. Small moments when the past and present aligned briefly. Sitting with your mother one evening, drinking tea by the stove, she told you stories about the family while you'd been gone. Your sister's marriage, your uncle's health problems, deaths and births, and all the ordinary events of life continuing. For a moment, listening to her voice, watching the firelight, feeling the warmth of the teacup in your hands, you felt almost normal. Almost like the person you'd been before. Almost home. I'm glad you're back, your mother said quietly. I prayed for you every day. Every single day for 5 years. I know, you said. And you did know. Those prayers, that faith, that someone somewhere was thinking of you, caring about whether you lived or died, that had mattered in Verkhoyansk. It had been one of the threads connecting you to the world beyond the cold. Meeting Ivan again was profound. He'd been released a year before you, had been back in St. Petersburg for over a year now. You traveled there, specifically to see him, needing to connect with someone who truly understood. He looked different, cleaner, healthier, his clothes proper and well-maintained, but his eyes had that same look you saw in your own mirror. The look of someone who'd seen things that couldn't be unseen, experienced things that couldn't be unexperienced. You spend an entire day together, mostly in silence or brief exchanges. You didn't need to explain things to each other. You already knew. Do you still feel it? You asked at one point. The cold? Every day, Ivan confirmed. It's always there. I don't think it ever leaves. Does it get better? The adjustment. Ivan considered this. Not better exactly. Different. Jot. You learn to function. You learn to play the role of a normal person. But you're always acting. The real you is still back there, still in survival mode. This was honest in a way that conversations with people who hadn't been to Verkhoyansk couldn't be. Do you regret surviving? You asked, the question you'd been afraid to voice to anyone else. Ivan thought for a long moment. Sometimes, he admitted, sometimes I think dying there would have been easier than living here carrying all of it. But then I have moments, small moments, where I feel something like contentment. And I think, I'm alive to feel this. Everyone who died there can't. So maybe surviving was worth it. Maybe carrying this burden is the price of being alive. This perspective helped. Survival had a cost. The memories, the trauma, the permanent changes, the inability to fully return to normalcy. But the alternative had been death. Not just death, but dying in the coldest place on Earth, far from home, forgotten. At least now, you were alive. Damaged, changed, but alive. You began to find purpose in connecting with other returned exiles, helping them adjust, sharing strategies for coping, simply being present with people who understood. This gave your suffering meaning. It had taught you things that could help others. A young man recently returned from 3 years in Verkhoyansk, was struggling badly. He couldn't sleep, couldn't work, was drinking heavily to numb the memories. You sat with him, shared your own struggles, helped him see that what he was experiencing was normal. Not healthy, but normal for someone returning from that place. Does it ever stop feeling like a nightmare? He asked. No, you told him honestly, but you learn to live with the nightmare. It becomes part of your landscape. You build a life around it. This honesty seemed to help more than false reassurance would have. Time passed. A year. Back. 2 years. 3. The sharp edges of the transition dulled slightly. You learned to function better in normal society, even if you never felt truly normal. You found work that was outdoors. As a surveyor, measuring land, working in all weather, the outdoor work helped. It felt more real than desk work. You remained connected to the network of returned exiles. This community became your anchor. People who understood. People who didn't need explanations. People who could sit in comfortable silence because words were inadequate anyway. Some returned exiles did better than others. Some managed to rebuild lives, marriages, careers. Others never fully adjusted. Some drank themselves to death. A few committed suicide, unable to bear the memories. And some, strangely, eventually requested to return to Siberia. Not to Verkhoyansk, but to other settlements. They become so adapted to that life that they couldn't function anywhere else. You understood this impulse. Part of you would always be in Verkhoyansk. The cold place had become part of your identity. You were a Verkhoyansk survivor. That fact defined you more than anything from your life before. Your mother asked once, gently, if you'd ever write about your experiences. Document what happened. Bear witness. Maybe someday, you told her, when I can find words for it. But you doubted words could capture it. The cold, the darkness, the suffering, the small acts of kindness that kept humanity alive, the friends made and lost, the slow transformation from who you'd been to who you'd become. How do you write about the coldest place on Earth when language itself seems to freeze trying to describe it? But maybe that was the point. Maybe the struggle to find words was itself important. Maybe bearing witness, however inadequately, was a responsibility to those who didn't survive, to tell the story, to make sure people knew, to prevent forgetting. You'd survived Verkhoyansk, but Verkhoyansk had survived in you. You carried it always, in your damaged body, your troubled sleep, your altered perceptions, your reordered priorities, your inability to truly feel warm. The ones who returned were never the same as those who'd left. You'd gone to the coldest place on Earth, and it had marked you permanently. You'd survived, but survival had a cost. And yet, despite everything, you were alive. You'd endured. You'd proven something about human resilience, about the ability to survive the seemingly unsurvivable. The cold had tried to break you. It had scarred you, changed you, taken pieces of you, but it hadn't won. You were still here, still breathing, still carrying the memories of those who weren't. And that, ultimately, was what returning meant. Not returning to who you'd been, that person was gone, but returning to life, carrying what you'd learned, honoring what you'd survived. The journey from Verkhoyansk wasn't measured in kilometers. It was measured in the distance between death and life. And you'd made that journey, impossibly, painfully, but completely. You'd returned. Closing. The cold that remains, so we've walked through this journey together, from arrest in warmth to exile in the coldest place on Earth, through the endless journey across frozen Siberia, through 5 years of survival at the pole of cold, and finally, through the difficult return to normal life that could never quite be normal again. If you were transported back to Verkhoyansk in the 1880s, you wouldn't survive. Not because you lacked courage or strength or determination, but because survival, it required more than any of those qualities. It required knowledge that could only be gained through experience, adaptations that could only develop over time, and a kind of acceptance of suffering that goes against every instinct of modern life. The modern world has protected us from extreme hardship in ways we rarely acknowledge. We live in climate-controlled environments. We have abundant food. We have medical care for injuries and illnesses that were death sentences in the past. We have freedom of movement, freedom of thought, freedom from arbitrary imprisonment. The people who were sent to Verkhoyansk had none of this. They had only themselves, each other, and their determination to survive one more day. Many didn't make it. The cold took them through exposure, through frostbite, through disease, through despair. But some survived, like the man whose story we've been following. Real people endured real suffering in the coldest inhabited place on Earth, without any of the advantages we take for granted today. Modern Yakutsk, which we glimpsed at the beginning of this journey, has technology now. Heated garages for the cars, buildings on stilts to protect the permafrost, double-glazed windows, insulated clothing, the Natasha covers to keep engines from freezing, coffee shops to warm up in, the ability to leave if conditions become too extreme. The exiles of the 1880s had none of this. They had crude wooden buildings, inadequate clothing, minimal food, and no escape. The same temperatures, -50, -60, -65, but with no protection beyond what they could improvise from available materials. Think about that contrast. The same place, the same brutal climate, but the difference between survival with technology and survival without it, between choosing to live somewhere difficult and being forced to suffer there as punishment. Today, when we see images of extreme cold, when we hear about record-breaking low temperatures, we might feel a momentary sympathy. Then we turn up our thermostats, put on our modern insulated jackets, and continue our comfortable lives. But understanding what it really meant to survive in places like Verkhoyansk before modern technology, that requires imagination. It requires really thinking about what -60 degrees means when you don't have central heating, when your building has ice on the inside walls, when your food is frozen solid, and your only source of warmth is a crude stove burning through limited firewood. It requires imagining the darkness. 21 hours a day in the depths of winter, with only a few hours of weak twilight to break the monotony. Imagine living like that for months. Imagine what that does to your mind, your body, your spirit. It requires imagining the isolation, not just physical isolation from the rest of the world, but psychological isolation, knowing that no one is coming to save you, that you're trapped in this place for years, that your only chance of survival is your own endurance, and the help of equally desperate fellow prisoners. The people who survived Koyansk weren't superhuman. They were ordinary people who found extraordinary resilience within themselves. They adapted, they learned, they helped each other, they endured, day by day, hour by hour, one moment of survival leading to the next, and they carried that experience with them forever. The cold became part of them. The memories, the trauma, the lessons learned, these never left. Even decades later, survivors would feel cold in warm rooms, would starve checking their extremities for frostbite that couldn't occur, would wake from nightmares of being lost in the fog. Survival had a cost that extended far beyond the 5 or 10 years of the sentence. It cost them parts of their bodies, parts of their sanity, parts of their ability to be normal. But they paid that cost because the alternative was dying in the coldest place on Earth, forgotten and alone. Tonight, as you lie in your comfortable bed, in your warm room, think about this. Think about the extraordinary privilege of warmth, of safety, of freedom. Think about how different your life is from the lives of those Siberian exiles. Think about how fortunate you are to live in a time and place where extreme suffering isn't an accepted punishment, where human rights exist, where technology protects us from the worst extremes of nature. And maybe, just maybe, let that awareness shift something in you. Let it make you more grateful for what you have. Let it make you more compassionate toward those who suffer. Let it remind you that human beings can endure almost anything, but shouldn't have to. The cold still exists. Yakutsk still experiences those brutal winters. The permafrost still runs hundreds of meters deep. The pole of cold still lives up to its name. But now people live there by choice, with technology to protect them, with the ability to leave if conditions become unbearable. The exiles didn't have choice. They had only endurance. And some of them survived. Their stories matter, not just as historical curiosities, but as reminders of human resilience, human cruelty, and human capacity for kindness, even in the most brutal circumstances. So as you drift off to sleep tonight, warm and safe, remember the cold place. Remember the people who survived there. Remember that the warmth you feel isn't just physical. It's the warmth of living in a world that, for all its problems, is infinitely better than the world of Siberian exile. Remember and be grateful. Good night, everyone. Stay warm.